Clayton Voss didn't even look at her when he said it. He was talking to the men, 30 of them, standing in the pale morning dust of the Texas spring camp, and he gestured toward Lillian Hayes the way a man gestures toward a broken fence post. Something inconvenient, something to be dealt with and moved past. She wants to ride the drive, he said, and the word she carried every ounce of contempt a man could pack into a single syllable. Fine. She can have the chuck wagon. Laughter rippled through the camp like a wave. Not polite laughter. The kind that has teeth. Lillian stood 18 feet away and did not flinch. She was 27 years old, 5'4", and she had buried her husband 11 days ago. Her hands were still. Her jaw was set. But her chest felt like something had cracked open inside it, and cold air was rushing through. The chuck wagon sat at the far edge of camp. Even from a distance, she could see the warped sideboard, the rusted iron, the barrel that sat slightly lopsided because its seal had long since rotted through. It wasn't an assignment. It was a verdict. If you're watching this right now and you've ever been handed the thing nobody else wanted, stay with me. Because what Lillian Hayes does next will change how you think about what it means to refuse to be broken. Subscribe to this channel and follow her story all the way to the end. Leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. You won't want to miss what comes next. The morning her husband died, Lillian had been in the kitchen. She heard the sound from the back pasture, not a scream, not a shout, just a single sharp crack of wood and then silence where there should have been sound. Daniel had been mending the corral gate for the 3rd time that season. The hinges were old. He'd known they were old. He'd kept saying he'd replace them after the roundup. He didn't make it to the roundup. The doctor from Abilene arrived 4 hours later, after riding hard from town, and he said what doctors said in those years, that it was fast, that it was likely painless, and that there was nothing anyone could have done. He folded his hat in his hands while he said it and didn't look at her directly. Nobody did in those first days. People looked at the floor, at the wall, at the middle distance just past her left shoulder, as if her grief were a bright light, and staring at it too long might damage something in them. She didn't cry until the 3rd day. She'd been too busy. There were hands to notify, accounts to settle, a ranch dog that kept sitting at the gate, waiting for a man who wasn't coming back. Daniel's brother rode up from San Antonio and offered to take the livestock off her hands at a reasonable price, with the emphasis on reasonable delivered in the particular tone men used when they expected no pushback. Lillian thanked him for coming and told him the livestock wasn't for sale. He'd stared at her as if she'd said something in a foreign language and repeated the offer, slightly louder, with slightly different emphasis. "I heard you the first time," she said. "The answer is still no." He left the following morning without saying goodbye. What Lillian had not told Daniel's brother, and what she had not yet told anyone, was that Daniel's partnership in the Voss Cattlemen's Cooperative, the quarter share he'd built over 9 years of hard seasons, and scarce water had passed to her outright under the terms of the partnership deed. She'd found the document in the tin box under the floorboard of his study the day after the funeral, written in Daniel's careful hand and witnessed by 2 men whose signatures she didn't recognize. He'd drawn it up without telling her. A last act of love from a man who'd known, maybe better than she had, that the world was not in the habit of treating women fairly. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it inside the cover of the cookbook her mother had given her the year she was married. The most valuable thing she owned, hidden inside the second most valuable thing she owned. Spring roundup at Voss's main camp was 6 days away. She began packing. The drive north the Chisholm Trail to the Kansas railhead at Abilene happened every year, and every year Clayton Voss ran it with the precision and quiet brutality of a man who had never questioned his own authority. He was 53, thick through the shoulders, with a face like worked leather and pale eyes that had learned to calculate profit before they'd learned to show warmth. He had built the Voss Cattlemen's Cooperative himself, from 300 head and a borrowed stake, and he regarded the partnerships he'd accumulated over the years the way a man regards the rooms in his house, useful, necessary, and ultimately his to manage. When Daniel Hayes had taken sick the previous autumn, Voss had done the math quietly and privately. A man with no sons, a wife who'd grown up on a small farm in East Texas, and a quarter share that represented the best grazing land in the cooperative's territory. It was a problem with an obvious solution, provided Daniel died before he had time to complicate matters with lawyers. Lillian Hayes arriving at camp with a packed trunk and a face like a closed door was not part of Voss's calculation. He met her at the edge of camp before most of the hands were up, which was where he'd wanted the conversation to happen. Private enough to be civil, public enough that she'd understand she had no allies present. He offered her coffee from the battered pot on the cook fire, and she accepted it, which he'd not expected. And then he told her, in the plainest language possible, that the trail drive was no place for a woman alone, and that her grief must be clouding her judgment, and that he was prepared to purchase her inheritance at a fair price that reflected current market conditions. She drank the coffee without interrupting him. When he finished, she asked if he was done. He said he was. She said, "I've read the partnership deed, Mr. Voss. My husband filed a copy with the county clerk in Abilene. There's a third copy with an attorney in San Antonio. My share rides north with this herd, whether you approve of it or not. So the question isn't whether I'm going. The question is what role I'll take when I get there." Voss looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted its weight, and a chain clinked against wood. "Chuck wagon," he said finally. He hadn't planned it. Came to him the way good tactics always did, quickly, cleanly, without sentiment. Chuck wagon was the lowest position on any drive. The cook who ran it had no authority over the men, no say in the route, no role in the cattle decisions. It was the one job that would keep her occupied, keep her out of his conversations with buyers and trail bosses, and most importantly guarantee that she'd fail publicly and completely. Because the chuck wagon currently had no working cook, no functional supplies, and equipment that had been deteriorating since the last drive hand quit in the middle of winter. He expected her to protest, to argue, to perhaps cry, which would have settled the matter efficiently. Instead, she put down the empty coffee cup and said, "I'll need a full inventory of the wagon's supplies." "There aren't many," Voss said. "I'll find out for myself," she said, and walked toward it. The chuck wagon was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected it to be bad. She spent 2 hours going through every compartment, every drawer, every hanging hook and storage slot, and made a list on the back of an envelope she'd found in her trunk. Spoiled flour, hardtack that had gone to chalk, a 50-pound sack of dried beans that had split at the bottom and leaked half its contents through the wagon floor, salt pork that had turned the color of old wood, a water barrel with a split seam that wept a slow, steady rivulet into the dirt when she filled it from the creek. The cast-iron cookware was the only thing in reasonable condition, a large Dutch oven, skillet, a battered coffee pot, and a set of ladles and spoons that had been used hard and kept clean. Whoever had worked this wagon before had cared about his tools, even when he'd stopped caring about the rest of it. Stood at the back of the wagon with her list and looked at what she had. There was a moment, a real one, not the kind that happens in stories told later with smooth edges, where she simply sat down on the wagon step and put her face in her hands and breathed. Not crying, just breathing. Because sometimes the gap between what you have and what you need is so large that the only honest thing to do is acknowledge it before you start figuring out how to cross it. She thought about Daniel. Not the Daniel of the last year, when he'd been tired and moving slowly, and they'd both pretended not to notice. The earlier Daniel, the one she'd married, the one who'd told her once, sitting on the porch of their first little house, that she was the most practical woman he'd ever met, and that he meant it as the highest compliment. "The world respects pretty," he'd said, "but it needs practical." She lifted her face from her hands. She made a second list. What she could send for, and from whom, before the drive left in 3 days. The cook at the Hargrove Ranch, 12 miles east, was a woman named Pearl who had been feeding trail crews for 20 years, and who received Lillian at her kitchen table with no particular surprise and very strong coffee. "Heard you're taking the Voss chuck wagon north," Pearl said. "Word travels fast. It travels at the speed of men who think something is funny." Pearl refilled both cups without being asked. "What do you need?" Lillian put her second list on the table. Pearl read it slowly, running one thick finger down the page. Her expression didn't change. "I've got sourdough starter I can split. It's good, been going since before my youngest was born, and he's 17 now. I'll give you dried chills, some herbs, and I have a half barrel of decent cornmeal I haven't found a use for. What do you want for it?" "For the starter, nothing. Keep it alive, it's its own payment." Pearl folded the list and set it down. "For the rest, I'll take whatever you can spare when you come back through in the fall, if you're still speaking to me and not too proud." "Why would I be too proud?" Pearl looked at her steadily. "Because successful women sometimes forget who helped them when they were nobody. I won't, Lillian said. Pearl studied her for another moment and then stood and began pulling things from shelves. She returned to camp that evening with the wagon half reorganized and a plan that was still fragile in places but had a spine. The hands paid her varying degrees of attention, which was to say most of them ignored her, unless they were looking for something to find amusing, and 3 or 4 of them, the younger ones, the ones who hadn't made this drive before, watched her with an expression that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite concern. Just watching. There was one man she noticed watching differently. Cole Maddox was the trail boss, and she knew his name and rough biography, the way anyone who'd spent time around the cooperative knew the people who made it function. He was 41, had run the Voss drive for 7 consecutive years, and was known for losing neither cattle nor men in circumstances where other trail bosses lost both. She'd seen him twice before briefly, at cooperative meetings Daniel had taken her to, and both times he'd been doing the same thing he was doing now, standing slightly apart from the group, watching everything, saying very little. He was watching her unload the wagon with the particular expression of a man who is updating his assumptions. She met his eyes once, briefly. He nodded, not the performative nod of someone trying to be encouraging, but the small, acknowledging nod of one professional observing another at work. Then he went back to whatever he'd been thinking about. She didn't know yet what that nod would eventually cost him. The drive left at first light on a Thursday, and within an hour of leaving, Lillian understood something she hadn't fully understood before. A cattle drive is not a journey so much as a sustained emergency conducted over several hundred miles. The herd numbered 1,800 head, a mix of longhorns and mixed-breed cattle that moved like a slow, dark tide across the Texas grassland, driven by 9 riders who shouted and whistled and used every trick accumulated over years of experience to keep the massive animals moving in something resembling the right direction. Dust came up in billowing walls that coated everything: clothes, skin, the inside of the mouth and nose, and the sound was constant. Bellowing and hooves and men's voices, and the creak of leather, and the particular rhythmic jolt of wagon wheels, finding every imperfection in terrain that had no perfectly smooth inch anywhere. The chuck wagon ran ahead of the herd, which meant running through whatever country the cattle were going to cross before they crossed it, finding the stopping point for noon and night camp, and having food ready when the riders arrived. Lillian had one assistant, a 15-year-old named Tobias, who had been assigned to help the cook because he had fallen asleep during a watch 2 weeks earlier, and this was his punishment. He was sullen, sunburned, and deeply convinced that his present situation was the result of forces conspiring against him personally. "Have you cooked over a fire before?" she asked him, on the first morning. "Some," he said. "What does that mean?" "I can make coffee." "Good. Make coffee. And then come back and I'll show you how to keep the sourdough alive." He looked at the crock of starter she'd set in the shaded corner of the wagon box with an expression of profound skepticism. "It looks like it's already dead." "It's not dead. Just hungry. Everything that looks dead when it hasn't been fed is just hungry." She handed him the coffee pot. "Go." He went. The first noon meal was a modest survival biscuits from the sourdough starter. Fried salt pork that she'd salvaged and rinsed until the worst of the rot smell left it. Dried beans cooked with the chiles Pearl had sent. It wasn't good, it was sufficient, which in the circumstances was the same as a small miracle. The men ate quickly and without comment, the way men eat when they are hungry, and the food is merely food rather than an event. Except for one. She watched from the corner of her eye as Cole Maddox genuinely waited, standing slightly back from the serving line until every other man had taken his portion before he stepped forward. Took what remained, which was the smaller of the biscuits and the thinner end of the salt pork, and he ate standing up, looking out at the herd grazing in the midday heat. Nobody remarked on it. It had the quality of a ritual so long established that it had become invisible, something you don't notice until someone points it out, and then you can't stop noticing it. Lillian noticed. She went to sleep that first night in the narrow bunk she'd rigged in the wagon box, listening to the sounds of the camp settling around her, and she thought about Cole Maddox eating the leftover biscuit, thought about what it meant to have spent so long at the back of every line that it had become habit. She thought about Daniel eating leftover bread at his own kitchen table because he never remembered to save himself the first serving. She thought about herself, at 12 years old, eating whatever was left after her brothers had gone through the pot. She lay there in the dark, already planning the next day's meal. By the end of the first week, the men had divided into 3 camps in their opinion of her. though nobody articulated it in those terms. The first group, 4 or 5 of the younger hands, including Tobias, who had thawed considerably after she'd let him eat, before the cleanup had shifted from ignoring her to something approaching watchful respect. They didn't say much, but they refilled the water barrel without being asked, and when one of them found wild onions growing along a creek bank, he brought them to the wagon without explanation and laid them on the tailgate where she'd see them. The second group, the older hands, the ones who'd ridden Voss drives for years, maintained a careful neutrality. They ate what she served, returned their plates, and gave her no trouble. They also gave her no recognition. The third group was smaller, 2 men who had been with Voss long enough to have absorbed his particular attitude toward people he considered temporary inconveniences. They took their meals last, made comments just quietly enough to be deniable, and watched her with the patient hostility of people who expect to be proven right eventually. Voss himself rode a good horse and gave the impression of a man on an inspection tour of property he'd already decided to sell. He barely looked at the chuck wagon. He didn't need to watch what was happening there. He'd arranged it to fail on its own schedule. What he hadn't calculated was the sourdough starter. By the 9th day of the drive, Lillian had gotten the fermentation time exactly right for the altitude and the evening temperatures, and she had found a way to use the Dutch oven and a bed of coals that produced a bread with a proper crust, and a crumb that pulled apart in long, soft pieces that steamed when you broke them open. She'd traded 2 jars of rendered fat and a knot of dried herbs with a family at a farmstead they passed for a pound of proper lard and a bunch of dried sage. She'd caught fish from a creek crossing and stretched the salt pork supply by 3 days. The meal on the 9th night was a genuine thing. It wasn't a restaurant meal or a ranch house supper. It was camp food, rough and simple and made under difficult conditions, but it was the best camp meal any of those men had eaten on a drive, and they all knew it the moment the bread came out of the Dutch oven. There was silence around the fire. Real silence, the kind that follows something unexpected, rather than the ordinary silence of men eating, because they're too tired to talk. One of the older hands, a weathered man named Ira, who had not spoken directly to Lillian since the drive began, put down his cup and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "I have not had bread like that since I left Missouri." Nobody responded, but several men looked at their portions with renewed attention. Lillian, stirring the coffee pot, heard it. She did not smile, because she understood that this was not the moment for visible satisfaction. But something in her chest loosened, just slightly, in the way things loosen when a door opens that you were not sure would open. Covered Cole Maddox's plate, as she'd been doing every night for 5 nights, the best portion, covered with cloth, and set it beside the fire. He found it where he always found it. He stood still for a moment, looking at it, the way a man stands trying to understand something he can't quite name. Then he sat down and ate it. The second week brought the Red River crossing. She'd heard about it from Daniel, who'd heard about it from men who'd done the drive before him, and the stories had a way of expanding in the telling a river that was sometimes 30 yards wide and sometimes 300, depending on the rains, and that had swallowed cattle and horses and men who'd underestimated it. The year before, a trail boss from another outfit had lost 40 head and 1 rider at this crossing. Voss had made it through with everything intact, which was why the hands who'd done it before looked at the approaching water with a particular expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite acceptance, and was really just the face of people who understand that something they cannot control is about to require everything they have. Lillian had made up her mind 3 days before the crossing. The wagon couldn't cross the way it was loaded. Too heavy, too high, too likely to shift in the current and go sideways. She spent 2 evenings repacking, moving everything to the lowest possible position, securing the Dutch oven, the starter crock, the flour against the front wall of the wagon box where the center of gravity would be lowest. Tobias helped without being asked for the first time. He worked in silence, handing things up when she reached for them, and somewhere in the second hour of that work, he stopped being a punishment assignment and became, quietly and without ceremony, her assistant. "Are you scared?" he asked, around the 10th o'clock of the second evening. "Of the crossing?" Yeah, she thought about it honestly. Yes, but that's not the relevant question. What's the relevant question? Whether I'm scared enough to stop moving. He thought about that. "Are you?" "Not yet," she said. The crossing took 4 hours. The river was running high, not the worst it could run, but high enough that the first 2 steers that went in turned sideways and had to be driven back and restarted. The riders worked it like a problem that could be solved with enough patience and enough noise, which is what most large, chaotic problems were if you stripped away the fear. The chuck wagon crossed in the third wave, with Lillian driving and Tobias riding the lead horse of the team. Cole Matsmus rode alongside in the water, saying nothing but positioned exactly where she'd need someone to be if the wagon began to drift. She'd noticed this without commenting on it. He didn't offer help as if it were charity. He simply made himself available as infrastructure. The water came up to the wagon's axles and then above them. The horse's breathing changed that high, strained sound animals make when effort becomes fear. And Lillian kept her hands steady on the lines and her eyes on the opposite bank and counted in her head, which was something her mother had taught her to do when she was small, and thunderstorms came in fast off the flat. Count something. Counting gives the mind a job to do instead of just feeling the fear. They made the other bank with everything intact. She sat on the wagon's seat for a moment after the horses had steadied, and she looked back at the river. It hadn't been graceful. The wagon had fishtailed in the current for about 10 feet, and she'd made a correction that was too sharp, and then had to correct the correction. And Tobias had shouted something in panic that turned out to be unnecessary. And there had been one moment where the Dutch oven shifted and hit the side of the wagon box, with a sound like a bell being struck. They were on the right side of the water, and everything was where it was supposed to be, and that was enough. Cole Maddox pulled his horse up beside the wagon. He didn't say anything immediately. Then good crossing. It wasn't elegant, she said. Elegant doesn't matter. A cross is what matters. He rode back toward the herd. 12 days out, one of Voss's men, the taller of the two who had been openly hostile, walked up to the wagon at the noon stop and told Lillian that a proper cook didn't let the coffee get cold before the trail boss arrived. Coffee was not cold. She'd taken it off the coals 60 seconds before he spoke, and she could feel the heat radiating from the pot at 3 feet's distance. She looked at him for a moment. The coffee, she said, is at exactly the temperature it needs to be. If Mr. Voss wants it hotter, he's welcome to arrive earlier. The man looked at her with an expression that said clearly he had expected her to apologize, or flinch, or at minimum look uncertain. She did none of those things. She turned back to the fire. He didn't say anything else, but he told Voss. She knew he told Voss because she saw them speaking at the far edge of camp that afternoon, and Voss's eyes cut toward the wagon with the particular sharpness of a man making a note of something. She went to sleep that night, knowing she had spent some credit she hadn't planned to spend. In the dark of the wagon box, with Tobias asleep across the narrow aisle, she thought about what Daniel would have said. He would have said she was right, probably, and then he would have said she needed to be more careful about being right in ways that reminded powerful men of their own limitations. She missed him. Not the abstract grief of loss, but the specific, sudden missing of a person, his voice, his judgment, the particular way he'd rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking through something difficult. She missed having someone to think alongside. She turned onto her side and looked at the dark underside of the wagon canvas. Keep moving, she told herself. It wasn't a pep talk. It was just the truth. That was the only thing to do. The 15th day brought the first real storm. It came from the northwest, which the experienced hands had been watching for 2 days, with the careful attention of people who'd learned to read weather the hard way. Clouds built slowly all afternoon, a tall, dark architecture piling up on the horizon, and by the time the evening camp was being set, the wind had shifted, and the temperature had dropped enough that breath was showing. Cole Maddox rode through the camp at dusk, making sure everything was staked and secured, and he stopped at the chuck wagon long enough to say, "Without inflection, this is going to be a bad one. You should secure everything that can move." "I already have," she said. He looked at the wagon. Everything was indeed secured: the pots, the barrels, the Dutch oven, the hanging equipment that could become a projectile in high wind. "The fire," he said. "I have a plan for the fire." A long pause. "All right," he said, and moved on. The storm hit at midnight. It was the kind of storm that the Texas to Kansas corridor produces with a specific malice: wind that came in horizontal sheets, rain that hit exposed skin like thrown gravel, and lightning that turned the entire sky white every few seconds so that the landscape appeared in strobe cattle, dark shapes moving in panic, men on horseback shouting in directions that the wind immediately snatched and dissolved. The herd began to run. Not a full stampede. Cole and the night riders caught the edge of it early enough to bend it back on itself, but a partial break, maybe 400 head moving wrong and fast in the dark, and the riders who went after them did it in rain and mud and lightning, and did not come back until after 2 in the morning, soaked through, some of them having been in the saddle for nearly 20 consecutive hours. Lillian had the fire. She'd rigged a canvas windbreak on the leeward side of the wagon, angled and staked in a configuration she'd worked out theoretically 3 nights earlier when she'd seen the weather building. It wasn't elegant, it looked, as Tobias observed, like a collapsed tent in an argument with a tree, but it kept the fire alive through winds that would have killed an open flame in 30 seconds. She'd built the fire high before the storm hit and kept adding fuel as it burned, and she'd put the coffee on and the beans on and the last of the salt pork on because she knew what men coming back from a midnight stampede in a rainstorm needed, and it was not to wait for someone to start the cooking. At 2:15 in the morning, the first riders came in. They were so cold and exhausted that they arrived at the fire and stood in front of it for a moment, just absorbing the fact of it, the heat, the smell of coffee and food, the simple existence of a fire that had survived what the storm had thrown at it. Ira, the Missouri man, the one who hadn't spoken to her for 12 days, looked at the fire, looked at the food, looked at Lillian standing behind the cooking setup, with rain still dripping off the brim of her hat. He said, "How is the fire still lit?" "I didn't let it go out," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he held out his cup. She filled it. The riders came in by 2s and 3s over the next hour, and she fed all of them real food, hot food, the best she could manage from what she had, and nobody said much because there wasn't much to say. What she had done was a practical thing, a necessary thing, and the men around that fire understood necessity in their bones. They knew what it cost, in a storm like that, to stay up and tend a fire and have hot coffee ready at 2 in the morning. They knew because they understood what it cost to do hard things in bad weather, and they recognized it in someone else. Cole Mattox came in last, as he always did. He was soaking wet, and there was a cut on his forearm from something barbed wire or a branch. She couldn't tell, and he moved with the slightly careful gait of a man running on will rather than energy. He came to the fire and found his plate covered and waiting, set as always beside the best coals, and he stood looking at it for a long moment in the way she'd seen him look at it every night. He sat down heavily on an upturned crate. He uncovered the plate. He looked at what she'd made the best she could do from a depleted larder in a storm in the middle of the night, and something moved across his face that he didn't bother to hide, possibly because he was too tired to manage it. "Kept the fire," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, a pause. Rain was still coming down, lighter now, more of a hiss than a roar. "Nobody's ever done that before," he said. "Not on any drive I can remember. Storm comes in like that. The cook keeps the wagon. Doesn't try to run a fire in weather like this. I had a good windbreak." "You planned for it," he said. 3 days ago, you started planning for it." She didn't ask him how he'd noticed. A trail boss noticed everything. It was the job. "I plan for what I can plan for," she said. "The rest you deal with when it arrives." He ate in silence for a while. The camp settled around them, men wrapping themselves in wet blankets, horses standing with their heads down. Then, without looking up from his plate, "My mother used to put the covered plate beside the fire. When my father came in late, Lillian said nothing." "I don't know why I'm telling you that," he said. "You're tired," she said. "Tired people say true things." He looked up at that. His eyes in the firelight were not the guarded eyes of a man managing his image. They were just eyes, tired, and somewhere beneath the tiredness, surprised in the way a person is surprised when something they'd stopped expecting happens anyway. "Get some sleep," she said, not unkindly. He finished the meal, set the plate down, and without another word went to find wherever trail bosses slept when the cattle were settled and the storm had moved on. Lillian banked the fire, covered the remaining food, and sat for a few minutes alone in the quiet that follows emergency. Her hands were red from the cold and the work. Her back hurt from standing for hours in wind and rain. Canvas windbreak had developed a tear that would need mending before the next bad weather. She realized, more awake than she'd been in weeks. Not the desperate wakefulness of grief or anxiety. Something older and cleaner, the wakefulness of a person who has done a hard thing and come out the other side of it intact. She thought about the drive still ahead, at least 3 more weeks to Abilene, with whatever the trail had left to throw at them. Thought about Voss, riding his good horse, calculating. Thought about the legal documents in the cover of her cookbook, and whether they were going to be enough when the time came. She thought about Cole Mattox saying nobody's ever done that before, with the particular quietness of a man who had, for a very long time, expected very little from the people around him. She folded the thought away and went to check on the sourdough starter, which needed to be fed whether or not the world was cooperating, and which did not care about storms, or cattle, or the politics of powerful men. Starter was fine. She fed it, covered it, and put it back in its corner, and went to get what sleep she could before the next morning called for something new from her. The sourdough starter was fed every morning at the same hour, regardless of what else was happening. Lillian had learned this from her mother, who had kept a starter alive for 31 years through 2 droughts, a flood, a house fire that took the back kitchen wall, and the deaths of 2 children. Starter had survived all of it because her mother treated it not as a luxury but as infrastructure, something as necessary to maintain as a water barrel or a wheel axle. You fed it because if you didn't feed it, it died. And if it died, you lost something that couldn't be quickly replaced. Lillian fed it now in the gray pre-dawn of the 18th day, the camp still quiet around her, Tobias still asleep in the wagon, the herd grazing in the dark beyond the firelight's reach. She worked by feel mostly the right amount of flour, the right amount of water, the temperature of the mixture against her palm, telling her what she needed to know. The starter smelled right, healthy, slightly sharp, with something underneath that she'd never been able to describe in words but always recognized immediately. Covered it, set it back in its corner, and began building up the fire. Storm had moved east overnight, leaving the air scrubbed clean and cold, and the ground a patchwork of standing water and churned mud that would make the morning's route difficult. She'd already looked at the terrain ahead when the first light came flat, mostly, but cut through with several low draws that would be running fast after last night's rain. The wagon would need to pick its lines carefully. She'd mentioned this to Cole at the edge of camp, before he'd gone to check on the scatter count from the partial stampede, and he'd listened without interrupting, and then said he'd have one of the riders scout the draws before the wagon moved. He hadn't treated it as a suggestion. He'd treated it as information worth acting on. That was new. Or if it wasn't new, she was only now in a position to notice it. The scatter count came back at 11 head short. Cole reported this to Voss at the breakfast fire, with the flat, precise delivery of a man who had learned to deliver bad news without editorializing. And Voss received it with the stillness of a man who is calculating rather than feeling. 11 head at current Abilene market prices was not a disaster. It was an irritation. The question was whether they were lost in the dark draws, or whether they'd run far enough in the night to be genuinely gone, and that question had to be answered before the drive could move. "Send 4 men back," Voss said. 2 hours. If they don't find them in 2 hours, they're gone. Cole sent 4 men. Then he came to the chuck wagon for coffee, which he didn't usually do. He usually took his morning meal on his own schedule, and Lillian handed him a cup without comment, because she understood that some mornings a man needs coffee handed to him, rather than having to ask for it. He stood at the edge of the fire, drinking. 11 head, she said. It wasn't a question, 11 that we know of. Might be less. Might be more. He turned the cup in his hands. The draws on the east side ran harder than I expected. Could have carried some of them further than the riders tracked last night. What's Voss going to do if they don't come back? A pause. He'll count the loss and move. He's not going to hold 1,800 head for 11 missing. Not with the schedule he's running. Is that the right call? Cole looked at her sideways. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of someone genuinely considering a question they hadn't expected. Probably, he said. Sentiment doesn't feed a drive. No, she agreed. But I wasn't asking about sentiment. He finished the coffee, handed back the cup, and went to do what trail bosses do, which is think about 11 things simultaneously while appearing to think about only one. The 4 men came back with 7 of the missing cattle 90 minutes later. The other 4 were gone. Voss accepted this with a brief nod and gave the order to move. The drive pulled out of the storm camp and into a morning that smelled like wet grass and lightning-cleared sky. And Lillian guided the wagon through the muddy draws, with Tobias riding the lead horse, both of them reading the ground the way you read ground when you know it can turn on you. What happened over the following week was not dramatic in any single moment. That was the thing she would remember later, that the change, when it came the way most real changes come, not in one event but in the accumulation of small ones, each too minor to mark on its own, each one adding weight to a scale that was gradually, almost imperceptibly, tipping. The wild onions the young hand had left on her tailgate became something she expected not from him specifically, but from the crew generally. Someone found dried corn at a farmstead crossing, and traded a piece of their own gear for it, not because they needed corn, but because they knew she could use it. A rider who'd killed a jackrabbit on the morning scout brought it to the wagon already cleaned rather than cooking it himself over a campfire. None of these things were accompanied by explanation or sentiment. They were just done, the way necessary things are done, by people who've recognized that something is necessary. She was running the food supply now like a serious operation. She kept a daily log in the back of the envelope she'd carried since the first day what was consumed, what remained, what she expected to need at the next resupply point, which was a trading post at a river crossing still 6 days out. She'd worked out that if the pace held and the weather stayed reasonable, she could stretch the current supplies to the post without reducing portions. The men were working hard. Reducing portions was not something she was willing to do if she could avoid it. She showed the log to no one, but she thought about it constantly, the way a person running something thinks about the numbers even when they're thinking about everything else. Tobias had evolved from sullen presence to something approaching a real assistant. He still slept too late if she let him, and still occasionally burned the coffee by forgetting to move it back from the direct flame, but he was genuinely useful in the ways that mattered. He could manage the team on rough terrain without panicking. He kept the wagon organized to her system without being asked to reorganize it each morning, and he had developed, through proximity and repetition, a basic competence with the sourdough that meant she could hand him the feeding task on the mornings when other things needed her attention first. "You're getting better," she told him, on a morning when he'd managed the starter correctly and had the coffee on before she'd had to say anything. He looked at the ground. "Don't tell the other guys." "Why not? They'll say I turned into a cook." "You're a cook," she said. "Or you're becoming one. There are worse things to become." He thought about this with the serious expression of a 15-year-old doing actual philosophical work. "My dad would say it's women's work," he said. Then immediately sorry. "That was I didn't mean. Your father ever go without food on a long trip because there was no one to cook it?" "Yeah," Tobias said. "Last winter." He said they ate cold biscuits for 11 days. "Then your father understands the value of the work, even if he doesn't understand the value of the person doing it." She handed him the skillet. "Get the bacon on." 20 days in, Voss called a pace meeting at the noon stop. He did this, occasionally assembled the senior men, spread a rough map of the route, and recalculated the schedule against the remaining distance and the cattle's condition. Lillian was not invited to these meetings, which was expected, and she went about the noon setup without attempting to position herself nearby. But she was 40 feet away, and the wind was flat, and Cole Maddox had a carrying voice when he was making a point. The point he was making was that the current pace was putting unnecessary strain on the cattle. "We're pushing too hard after the storm," he said. "The herd's not recovered. You can see it in the way they're moving, the back quarters lagging. If we keep this pace for another 3 days, we're going to start losing weight, and we'll come into Abilene with cattle that look like they've been driven, not raised." "We're behind schedule," Voss said. "A week of proper pace, and we'll make it up without sacrificing condition. Push now, and we'll lose money on the sale." "You've been trail boss long enough to know that buyers at the railhead don't wait," Voss said. "And I've been trail boss long enough to know that underweight cattle don't sell at the price you're expecting." There was a silence. Lillian kept her hands moving, stirring, checking, managing, and did not look toward the meeting. Voss said something she couldn't catch. Cole said something back. Then the sound of the meeting shifted toward the dispersal of men returning to their work. And a few minutes later, Cole walked past the chuck wagon on his way to his horse. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. Neither of them said anything. But the look held the quality of two people who have understood the same thing at the same time without needing to articulate it. Pace slowed the following morning. Not by much. Voss wouldn't show ground publicly, but enough that the cattle in the back quarter stopped lagging before noon. The trading post at Cutter's Crossing was smaller than Lillian had expected and better stocked than she'd hoped, which was the best possible combination. She arrived 2 hours ahead of the main drive, which was the point of running the wagon ahead, and spent 2 hours negotiating with the post's owner, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Frances Cutter, who had inherited the post from her husband and expanded it in ways he likely hadn't imagined and definitely hadn't planned. Frances moved through her own inventory with the efficiency of someone who had memorized every item and its exact worth, and had no patience for people who tried to underpay. Lillian had a list and a budget and a clear idea of her priorities. And Francis had goods and a clear idea of what they were worth, and the negotiation between them was the best kind, brief, direct, and concluded to both parties' satisfaction. "You're the widow Hayes," Francis said at the end of the transaction, while Tobias loaded the wagon. It wasn't a question. "That's right. Heard you took the Voss Chuck wagon." "I did." Francis looked at her with the particular appraisal of a woman who has run a business alone long enough to have learned quickly how to read other people's competence. "How's it going?" "Better than he planned," Lillian said. Francis made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close. "I imagine so." She handed over the last bundle dried fruit, coffee beans, a small crock of preserves she'd added without being asked. "From me," she said. "No charge." Lillian looked at the crock. "Don't look at it like that," Francis said. "It's preserves, not a statement. Take them and make something good." "Thank you," Lillian said. "Come back through on your return trip," Francis said. "I'll want to hear how it ended." The drive was 23 days old when Cole Maddox told Lillian something about himself that he had not intended to tell her. It happened at the tail end of a long evening the cattle settled, the hands mostly in their bedrolls, the fire burning low. Lillian had stayed up later than usual because the sourdough had needed attention, and then the coffee pot had needed mending where the handle had worked loose, and by the time she'd finished both tasks the camp was quiet, and the sky above the flat Kansas horizon was extraordinarily clear and dark and scattered with stars, so dense they blurred into each other at the edges of her vision. Cole was still up. He was usually the last to sleep, the trail boss's habit of sleeping lightly and late, always half listening for the sound of something going wrong. He sat on his customary upturned crate on the far side of the fire, and when she sat down on the wagon step to rest her hands for a few minutes, they were close enough to talk without raising their voices. She hadn't planned to stay, but her back hurt and the night was quiet, and there was something about the exhaustion of the 23rd day that dissolved the usual calculation about what to say and what to leave alone. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He looked over. "Probably. The waiting at meals. Every night you wait until everyone else has eaten. You've done it since the first day." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone avoiding the question, but the quiet of someone deciding how honestly to answer it. "Old habit," he said. "From where?" Another pause. The fire shifted and resettled. "I grew up in a house with 8 children," he said finally. "My father ran a farm that was never quite large enough for the number of people trying to live on it. By the time dinner came around, if you weren't quick, you got whatever remained, which was usually not much." He picked up a stick and turned it in his hands. "I was the oldest. I learned early that if I waited, made sure everyone else had enough, first there was less fighting. Less of everyone going to bed angry." A pause. "Less of my mother looking at the pot when it was empty and trying not to show that she was calculating whether she'd eaten enough herself." Lillian said nothing. She understood the particular kind of silence that keeps a person talking when they're saying something true. "I've done it so long I don't think about it anymore," he said. "Just what you do." "You don't have to do it on this drive," she said. "I know. But you do." "Yeah." He put the stick in the fire. "Old habits." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "Covered plate," she said. "I put it there because—" "I know why you put it there," he said, not unkindly, just directly, with the flatness of someone who has said a thing and is now past the point of pretending he hasn't. She nodded. "My mother did something like it," he said. "For my father. When he came in late from the fields, she'd set aside the best of what was in the pot, cover it with a cloth, keep it warm by the stove, and when he came in, it would be there. He always acted like it was just what happened. Like the food appeared because that's what food did." A pause. "But I watched her do it. Every night. She made the decision every night to give him the best portion, even when we were short. I didn't understand it when I was young. I thought it was unfair. And now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Now I think it was the way she showed him he was worth taking care of," he said, even when everything else was telling them both otherwise. The fire crackled. Lillian said, "You are worth taking care of." Turned and looked at her. Full on, not the sideways glance of someone managing a conversation. Just looking at her, directly, with that exhausted, unguarded expression she'd seen at 2 in the morning after the storm. "That's a kind thing to say," he said. "It's a true thing," she said. "Kind and true aren't always the same. This one is both." He looked at the fire again. Something had shifted in the set of his shoulders, some tension that had been there so long it had become structural, and now was marginally less present. "You should get some sleeps," he said. "The terrain tomorrow is going to be rough on the wagon." "I know. I already checked the axles." "Of course you did." He said it without irony. Just recognition. She went back to the wagon. She lay in the dark, listening to the cattle and the wind and the distant, occasional sound of a rider making the night rounds, and she thought about 8 children and a farm too small, and a mother setting aside the best portion every evening. She thought about all the invisible, uncounted labor of people who keep things alive: fires, starters, herds, families, marriages by doing the work quietly and without expectation of acknowledgement, because the thing needing to be kept alive is more important than the credit for keeping it. She thought about Daniel again, not with grief exactly, or not only with grief, with something more complicated, with the specific ache of loving someone whose absence has made you understand them better than their presence allowed. She fell asleep, still thinking about it, and dreamed of nothing she could remember in the morning. The trouble Voss had been building toward arrived on the 27th day, in a form Lillian hadn't quite anticipated. He sent his man, the taller one, the one who'd challenged her about the coffee, to the chuck wagon at the morning stop. And this time the man had a piece of paper, a ledger page, handwritten, itemizing the supply expenditures from Cutter's Crossing, with certain figures circled in ink. He placed it on the wagon tailgate without preamble and said that Mr. Voss wanted an accounting of the chuck wagon expenses, specifically the items that appeared to be in excess of what a standard trail cook required. Lillian dried her hands on her apron and looked at the ledger page. The items circled were the dried fruit, the preserves Frances had given her at no charge, and a quantity of cornmeal that she'd purchased deliberately because she had a plan for it that would extend the meat supply for the final stretch of the drive. They were not extravagant. They were, in fact, exactly what a careful cook would purchase if she were thinking 3 weeks ahead rather than 3 days ahead. "Tell Mr. Voss the full accounting is in the wagon log," she said, "and that he's welcome to look at it himself. The circled items are all within the budget he allocated at the start of the drive." The man looked at her. "He wants to know why a chuck wagon cook is making purchasing decisions without authorization." "Because that's what chuck wagon cooks do," she said. "They're responsible for provisioning the crew. That's the job." The job, the man said, with a particular inflection, doesn't include going over budget or making decisions above your station. "I haven't gone over budget," she said, "and my station on this drive is provisioning 30 men on a 6-week trail. If Mr. Voss wants to debate cornmeal purchases, I'm happy to have that conversation in front of the crew at the noon meal. I can explain exactly why I bought it and what it's going to mean for the last 3 weeks of their food supply." The man stared at her. "Otherwise," she said, "tell him the ledger is in order." He took the ledger page back and walked away without saying anything else. She watched him go. Her hands, she noticed, had steadied during the conversation when they'd wanted to shake. She had kept them still by gripping the wagon tailgate, a trick she'd learned in the first week, when she'd needed to be calm in front of men who were looking for visible weakness. Tobias appeared at her elbow. He'd been inside the wagon during the conversation and had obviously heard everything. "Are you in trouble?" he asked. "Probably some," she said. "But I'd be in more trouble if I'd apologized for doing my job correctly. Go check the coffee." He went. She stood at the tailgate for another moment, looking out at the flat, yellowing Kansas grass stretching north toward a horizon she couldn't yet see the end of. And she thought about what Voss was doing with that ledger page and what it told her about how much time she likely had left before he made his real move. Not much. They were 10 days from Abilene, and the approach to the railhead was where the cattle deals were made and where the cooperative's proceeds would be calculated and distributed. If he was going to find a way to cut her out, he needed to do it before they arrived. She needed to get there first. Not geographically. Something else. She needed to make herself impossible to dismiss before they got there, in a way that had nothing to do with Voss's opinion, and everything to do with the opinion of 30 men who ate her food twice a day and had spent 27 days watching what she could do. Started with the cornmeal. That evening, for the first time on the drive, she made something that required more time and more care than the standard trail fare, a proper skillet corn cake, the kind that needed to rest in a Dutch oven buried in coals for 40 minutes, the kind that came out with a golden crust that cracked when you broke it, and a dense, faintly sweet interior that was as far from hardtack as anything she'd made on the trail. She made it in 4 batches because one Dutch oven could only hold so much, and she stayed by the fire for 2.5 hours, managing the coal temperature, shifting the oven, timing by instinct and experience. The smell of it reached the camp while the men were finishing their evening tasks. She'd learned, over the past 4 weeks, that smell was its own argument. A man who is tired and covered in trail dust and has eaten the same rotating set of provisions for 4 weeks will walk toward the smell of good corn cake whether he intends to or not. It's not a conscious choice. It's older than conscious choice. They came to the fire in ones and twos before she'd even called the meal, which she normally had to do by ringing the iron triangle that hung from the wagon's side rod. Tonight, she didn't ring it. They came anyway. She served the corn cake last after the beans. After the meat, as a final thing, the way you hold back the best for when people are paying attention. Cut it into proper portions, which required actual knife work and attention to equal distribution, and she served it warm, which meant handing each man his slice while it was still giving off steam. Camp ate in what she had come to think of as the good silence. Not the silence of exhaustion or indifference, but the silence of people who are paying attention to what they're eating. Ira ate his corn cake in 3 careful bites and then looked at the empty plate with an expression of genuine disappointment that anything finite should come to an end. The young hand who'd brought her the wild onions she'd learned, his name was Garrett, 18 years old, from a family farm in East Texas, looked at his second-to-last bite for a full 3 seconds before eating it, in the manner of someone savoring the time left. Tobias, who had been allowed a full portion for the first time without waiting for seconds, looked at Lillian with something that was trying not to be gratitude and failing. Cole received his covered plate as always, set beside the fire. Beneath the cloth tonight, he found a larger portion of corn cake than anyone else had received, not extravagantly larger. Not so much that it would be obvious, but enough that he would know it was deliberate. He looked at it, he looked at her, across the fire. She was already attending to something else, and did not acknowledge the look, felt it. On the 29th day, one of the younger riders came off his horse badly at a creek crossing, not a dramatic fall. Just the quiet, grinding kind where a horse puts a foot wrong in soft bank mud and goes down sideways, and the rider comes off into the water and the bank and ends up with a shoulder that wasn't quite right and a gash on his forearm that bled more than it deserved to. He was helped to the chuck wagon because the chuck wagon was where you went when something was wrong with you onto trail drive, in the absence of a doctor. Lillian looked at the shoulder first. She pressed it carefully in the places that mattered, watched his face for what it told her about where the pain was and wasn't, and concluded that it was wrenched rather than broken, which was bad enough, but not the kind of bad that stopped a drive. The arm she cleaned with the whiskey she kept for exactly this purpose and wrapped with strips of clean cotton she'd been carrying since the first day, precisely because this kind of thing happened on trail drives. The rider's name was Peter, and he was 20 years old, and he bore the cleaning and wrapping with the stoic silence of someone who is trying very hard not to let the pain show and is only partially succeeding. "Keep it elevated tonight," she told him, "and come back in the morning so I can look at it again." "I can ride," he said. "I know you can. Come back anyway." Came back in the morning, and the morning after that, and by the 3rd day the arm was healing cleanly, and his shoulder had calmed to the point where he could use it for light work. He said thank you on the 3rd morning in the brief, sidelong way young men say thank you when they're grateful, but haven't had much practice expressing it. "You're welcome," she said. "Try not to fall off your horse again for a while." "I'll try," he said, and went back to work. Voss saw the interaction from across the camp. She didn't look at him when she felt him watching. She went back to the breakfast prep as if he weren't there, which was becoming easier with practice. 30 days into the drive, with 9 days to Abilene, Lillian sat down at the end of an evening and did a full accounting in her head, not the food ledger, but the other kind, the kind you do when you need to understand exactly where you stand. She stood, in her own assessment, considerably better than she'd stood 30 days ago. She had fed 30 men twice a day for a month under trail conditions, through a major storm, a river crossing, a partial stampede, and supply constraints that would have broken a cook who didn't know how to plan. The food she'd produced had been, by any fair measure, better than what a Voss drive crew expected. She had managed a 15-year-old from punishment assignment into something approaching a real apprentice. She had kept herself alive, solvent, and professionally intact in the face of sustained low-level opposition from a man with considerably more structural power than she had. She had not, in 30 days, once asked for permission to do anything that fell within her legitimate authority. This had cost her some goodwill from Voss. It had, she believed, earned her something more durable from everyone else. Cole Maddox had stopped eating last. She had not mentioned this to him and had no intention of doing so. But she had noticed 3 days ago that he had moved himself into the regular serving line without ceremony or explanation. He still took his meal and moved to the edge of the fire rather than eating in the group, which was its own habit and probably not one that would change quickly. But he was no longer waiting for everyone else to finish before he stepped forward, and the expression on his face when he received his portion, which she still made sure was a good one, covered and set with care, was no longer the careful blankness of a man managing his expectations. It was, she thought, something closer to the face of a person who has decided, quietly and without announcement, to believe that there is enough. She didn't know yet what that meant for what came next. She didn't know what Voss was planning, or when he would make his move, or how the cattle sale would unfold, or what 9 more days of trail and then the railhead would bring. She knew what she could control and what she couldn't, and she had learned, in the past 30 days, to stay very focused on the distinction. What she controlled was the wagon, the food, the crew's daily sustenance, and the quality of her own work. What she could not control was Clayton Voss, the cattle market, or the judgment of men who had already decided what they thought of her. She could only make it as difficult as possible for those men to hold on to their original opinion. She banked the fire, checked the starter, confirmed the water barrel levels, and looked out at the dark Kansas plain, spreading north toward a railhead city she'd never seen that held the resolution to everything she'd spent 30 days building toward. 9 days. She went to sleep. 9 days looked different in the counting than they felt in the living. The morning after Lillian's accounting, the quiet one, done at the end of an evening with the fire banked, and the camp dark arrived, with a problem she hadn't planned for, which was the nature of problems. They don't consult your schedule before showing up. The lead wheel on the chuck wagon had developed a crack. She found it at first light when she was doing the pre-departure check she did every morning, circuit of the wagon that took 8 minutes, and had already caught 2 issues before they became disasters. This one she almost missed, a hairline fracture in the wooden wheel spoke, starting at the hub and running outward maybe 3 inches. In dry weather, on flat ground, it might hold another week. In the wet, churned terrain they'd been crossing since the storm terrain that grabbed at wheels and put lateral stress on spokes with every rut and draw, it was a wheel that was going to fail. The only question was when and where. She crouched in the pre-dawn dark, holding a lantern close to the spoke, and thought about the options in the same way she thought about the food ledger, methodically, without sentiment, starting from what was true and working toward what was possible. What was true, the wheel needed repair. What was possible at current position? 6 days from any real settlement and 9 from Abilene, limited. What she had in the wagon's tool supply, a wood wrap, some wrapping wire, pine pitch she'd carried since the Hargrove Ranch on the advice of Pearl, who had told her that pine pitch and wrapping wire had saved more wagons than any wagon maker wanted to admit. She spent 40 minutes on the repair before Tobias woke up. It wasn't a fix. It was a stabilization, the pitch packed into the crack, the wire wound tight around the spoke to hold the pitch in place and brace the wood against lateral flex. She'd seen her father do something similar to a wagon gate in a drought year, when there was no lumber to replace it, and they couldn't afford to wait. When Tyus emerged from the wagon, she was washing the pine pitch off her hands with water she'd have preferred to use for coffee. He looked at the wheel. He looked at her hands. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said, and went to start the coffee. Told Cole about the wheel before breakfast. He listened, crouched down to look at the spoke himself, pressed it with his thumb in a couple of places, and stood back up. How long will the repair hold? If we take it carefully over the bad terrain, 4 days, maybe 5. After that, it depends on what the ground gives us. We've got some rough draws in the next 2 days, he said. I'll route the wagon around them. Longer but better ground. That adds time. Some. He looked at her. You should have told me about the wheel first thing. Not after you'd already done the repair. She considered this. I wanted to know what I was working with before I brought it to you. Next time, bring it to me before. He said it without heat, just clearly. The way he made most of his points once, directly, and then he moved on. All right, as I said, he moved on. The detour around the worst of the draws added half a day to the march, which Voss noticed and did not comment on publicly, which was itself a kind of commentary. He rode past the chuck wagon in the mid-morning without looking at it, his eyes on the horizon, His posture carrying the particular tension of a man who is keeping something to himself that he intends to use later. Lillian watched him ride past and thought, he's saving it. Whatever he was building toward, he wanted to do it close to Abilene. Close enough to the sale that there wouldn't be time to recover from it. She filed the thought and kept moving. The terrain for the rest of that day was easier than the day before, flat, mostly, with long grass that bent in a south wind and caught the afternoon light at an angle that turned the whole plain a pale, shifting gold. It was objectively beautiful country, and Lillian was not unaware of it. She'd grown up in East Texas timber country, where the land closed in around you, and the sky was something you saw in pieces through the trees. And this openness, this sky that went all the way to every horizon without interruption, still caught her sometimes at the edge of her attention, pulling at something she didn't have a clean name for. Daniel had loved this kind of country. He'd talked about it the way people talk about a place they haven't seen yet but are certain they'd love, and she'd thought at the time that it was a strange thing to love a place you'd only imagined. She understood it better now. She kept the thought to herself, the way she kept most of the thoughts about Daniel, not suppressed, not pushed away, just held privately in the space that was hers and nobody else's. Grief was like that. You didn't carry it out in front of you all the time. You carried it somewhere interior, and it came to the surface at odd moments, a particular quality of light, a smell, the sound of wind through grass, and then it receded again, and you kept working. On the 32nd day, Ira from Missouri did a thing that she hadn't expected. He came to the wagon before supper and stood at the tailgate with his hat in his hands, which was the universal posture of a man who had decided to say something he'd been deciding about for a while. He was 54 years old, leather-faced and quiet, and he had not spoken to her directly about anything beyond meal requests for the entire drive. "I owe you an apology," he said. Lillian stopped what she was doing. She was measuring out the evening's flour and looked at him. "First days," he said. "When Voss gave you the wagon, I laughed with the others." He turned his hat in his hands. That wasn't right. She considered how to receive this. She could be gracious in the way that cost nothing, or she could be honest, which cost something from both of them, but was worth more. "Stung," she said, not going to pretend it didn't. He nodded. "I know, and I knew it when I did it. That's what I'm apologizing for. I knew it, and I laughed anyway, because it was what everyone else was doing, and it was easier." He put his hat back on. "I don't like that about myself." "I appreciate you saying so," she said. And she meant it, not the polished version of meaning it, but the real version, where the apology actually landed somewhere and shifted something small but real. "The bread," he said. "It really is as good as my mother's. Better, maybe." She'd have hated me saying that. Lillian felt something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "Go sit down. Supper's in 20 minutes, he went. She turned back to the flour, and her hands were slightly less steady than they'd been before the conversation, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to be moved by it, and she was a little, and she didn't bother trying to talk herself out of it. Some things deserved to land. The trouble with the supply calculation arrived on the 34th day in the specific form of rain. Not a storm, nothing, with the violence of the one 3 weeks earlier, but a steady, persistent, low-sky rain that had been falling since before dawn, and showed no sign of any opinion about stopping. It made the ground soft and the air cold, and it meant that everything that could be kept dry needed to be kept dry, and everything that couldn't be kept dry was going to get wet and stay wet. And the psychological effect of rain on a crew 34 days into a long drive was something she'd learned to factor the way she factored weather and terrain, as a variable that affected the human element of the operation, just as surely as it affected the cattle. Cold, wet men needed more from a meal than warm, dry men. They needed the food to do more, not just fuel, but something that felt like warmth carried from the outside in, which meant the kind of cooking that used fat and heat and long cooking times in ways that the standard trail fare didn't prioritize. She used the last of Francis Cutter's preserves that evening. She'd been holding them for the right moment, which was not sentimentality, but strategy. Pearl had taught her years ago that in a long cook, you held your best elements for the moments when they would do the most work, not the moments when they would make the most impression. Preserves, a dark spice plum, sweetened with cane sugar, and something she thought might be a little bourbon, went into a glaze for the venison that one of the riders had brought in 2 days prior, and that she'd been managing carefully to stretch across the crew. The result was not fancy. It was dark and sticky and served over cornbread in the rain, eaten by men sitting under the partial shelter of horses and wagon canvas, cold water dripping from hat brims onto plate edges. It was the kind of food that made rain bearable. Not pleasant, the rain was still rain, but bearable. Cole ate his covered portion in the wagon's lee, standing rather than sitting because the ground was too wet for crates. And she watched him eat without appearing to watch, the way she watched most things, obliquely, with peripheral attention, giving the observation the space to be accurate. He ate like a man who had forgotten for a few minutes that he was cold and wet. That was enough. On the 35th day, the rain lifted, and on the 36th, they crossed into the last stretch before Abilene, and on the 37th day, Clayton Voss made his move. She knew it was coming, had known for days in the abstract, but the specific shape of it still caught her slightly sideways because it was more sophisticated than she'd expected from a man who generally favored blunt force. He did not confront her directly. Instead, he sent for her at the noon stop formally, through his man, who delivered the summons with the studied neutrality of someone who has learned to carry messages without becoming responsible for their contents. Mr. Voss would like to speak with Mrs. Hayes at her convenience. Which meant now, Voss was sitting on a camp stool near his tent, a small canvas tent he put up each evening, and that no one else on the drive used, because the hands slept on bedrolls, and Lillian slept in the wagon, and Cole slept wherever he happened to stop, which changed nightly. The tent was not about comfort. It was about separation. It communicated that Voss was a different category of person from the people around him. He offered her the other camp stool, which she accepted. "I've had a letter from Abilene," he said. She waited. "The buyers this year are different from last year's, more particular about the operations they deal with. They have concerns about the presentation of the Voss cooperative when it arrives at the railhead." He crossed his legs and looked at her with the measured pleasantness of a man delivering information he has carefully prepared, specifically about the chuck wagon situation. "What about it?" "A young widow running the chuck wagon is, how do they put it, an unusual arrangement." He paused. "It creates questions in the buyer's mind about the professionalism of the operation, about whether the cooperative is being run with the seriousness that a major purchase requires." Lillian looked at him steadily. "Who are these buyers?" "Men of considerable capital, out of Kansas City." "I'd like to see the letter." A brief pause. The pleasantness tightened fractionally at the edges. "The letter is a business communication. Not if the letter contains representations about my conduct of the chuck wagon that you're using to justify a personnel decision, I'm entitled to see it," she said. "That's what my husband's partnership deed gives me. I'm not a hired hand, Mr. Voss, I'm a partner. And partners have the right to examine the evidence behind operational decisions that affect them." The pleasantness was gone now. What replaced it was something older and less curated, the look of a man who has been told a thing he already knows, but had hoped to avoid being told directly. "You are a partner," he said, "in the cattle, not in the management of the operation. Show me where the deed makes that distinction." He said nothing. "You can't," she said, "because it doesn't." The silence between them had a specific texture, not empty, but full of the particular pressure of a confrontation that has arrived at its center and is waiting to see which direction it moves. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," Voss said finally. "I'm making it exactly as difficult as it is," she said. "You're the one who thought it would be easier." She stood, returned the camp stool to its position, looked at him once more. "I'll be at my wagon," she said. "If you'd like to continue the conversation with the letter present, I'm available." She walked back to the wagon, and her hands this time did not shake at all. She wasn't sure if that was confidence or the particular steadiness that comes after. You've been afraid of something long enough that the fear becomes familiar and stops interfering with function. Tobias was waiting at the tailgate with an expression that oscillated between anxious and trying not to look anxious. "How did it go?" "About as expected," she said. "Get the afternoon coffee on." Cole found her that evening after supper. He came to the wagon when the camp had quieted enough to have a conversation, without it being a performance when the hands were at their bedrolls, and Voss's tent was buttoned up, and the night riders had taken their positions with the herd. Stood at the wagon step and said, without preamble, "Voss told me what he's planning." She looked up from the log she was updating. "What is he planning?" "He's going to have you removed from the wagon before we reach Abilene. He's framing it as a personnel issue, says the buyers won't deal with an operation that has a woman running the chuck wagon. He's going to offer you a settlement, a small one. He'll argue that the drive expenses should be deducted from your share before the cattle sale proceeds are calculated." He paused. "By his math, That would leave you with almost nothing. She set down the pencil. Is the letter from the buyers real? She said. I don't know. I haven't seen it. He wouldn't show it to me. That tells you something, Cole said. It tells me several things. She looked at the log. The numbers there were real food costs, supply expenses, every transaction documented in her own hand from the first day. If Voss tried to inflate those numbers or attribute expenses to her that weren't hers, she had the record. Pearl had taught her that too, without knowing she was teaching it. You kept the receipts not because you expected to be cheated, but because keeping them meant that being cheated became significantly harder. Can't touch the partnership share, she said. Not legally. The deed is filed. He doesn't need to touch the share. He needs to touch the calculation. If he controls the sale negotiations and the accounting, he controls what number your quarter is applied against. Cole was quiet for a moment. He's done it before. Not with a partner. With a hired hand, a man who'd worked the drive for 3 years and was owed a significant bonus. Voss found reasons in the accounting. Lillian looked at him. Did you know about it when it happened? A pause that was honest rather than evasive. I knew something wasn't right. I didn't push. He held her gaze. I'm telling you now. She thought about what it cost him to say that, not the admission itself, but the implications of it. The acknowledgement of a thing he'd let slide and had been carrying since. That was its own kind of weight. The weight of knowing you'd looked away once, when you should have looked at something directly. Thank you, she said, for telling me. What are you going to do? She picked up the pencil again. I'm going to finish the log, and then I'm going to sleep, because we have 7 days left, and I still have 30 men to feed every day of them. She looked at him. And I'm going to think. He nodded. He stayed at the wagon step for a moment longer, not quite leaving. For what it's worth, he said, there are men on this crew who would stand up and say what they've seen. Came to that. She thought about Ira with his hat in his hands, about Garrett bringing wild onions to the tailgate, about Peter coming back 3 mornings in a row to have his arm checked because she'd asked him to, about 30 men who had spent 37 days eating food she'd made under conditions that had required more from her than anything she'd done before. I know, she said, it wasn't bravado. It was an accounting, the same kind she did every night, a true reading of what was real. Cole went to find his bedroll. Lillian sat with the log and thought, in the careful, unhurried way of a person working a problem that has a solution somewhere in it. On the 39th day, one of the night riders came off his horse. Not the gentle failure of a man going down on soft bank mud the way Peter had. This was different. This was a horse that had found a prairie dog hole in the dark at a canter, and the horse went down front first, and the rider a man named Dex, 43 years old. 10 drives in his experience went over the horse's head and hit the ground wrong and lay there, not moving in a way that the other night rider could see from 30 yards meant something serious had happened. The shout brought half the camp up within 4 minutes. Lillian was awake before the shout. She wasn't sure what had woken her. Possibly the sound of the fall carrying through the quiet night air. Possibly just the particular alertness that living in a trail camp for 39 days installs in a person. And she was already pulling on her boots when Tobias sat up and said, "What is it?" "Stay here," she said, and was out of the wagon before he'd finished processing the instruction. She reached Dex before anyone except the second night rider. He was conscious, which was the first relief. Conscious and trying to sit up, which she stopped by putting a hand on his chest and saying, calmly and firmly, "Don't. Stay still and tell me where it hurts." "Shoulder," he said.
"Right."
And Mai stopped. His face went white. "Your leg," she said.
"Yeah."
It was the right leg, below the knee, and even in the lantern light she could see what the problem was. She had seen a broken leg once before a ranch hand who'd had a horse roll on him when she was 14, and the leg had looked this wrong in exactly this same way. Not a compound fracture, at least, which was a mercy, but broken clearly and significantly. And a man 39 days into a trail drive with a broken leg, and no doctor within 2 days' hard ride, was a serious problem. Cole arrived 30 seconds after her. He looked at the leg once, and his expression didn't change, which was what she'd come to understand as his version of being calm in a crisis, not absence of reaction, but management of it. "What do we need?" he said. It was directed at her, which was she registered it only briefly, in the midst of the actual work, not nothing. "Straight wood," she said. 2 pieces, long enough to run from his knee to past his ankle. Strips of cloth clean if we have them. Whiskey. She looked at Dex. "This is going to hurt." "I know," he said. "I'll tell you before I do the worst of it." Closed his eyes. "All right." Cole had the wood and cloth within 4 minutes, which meant he'd pulled them together from whatever was closest without stopping to deliberate. She noted this the way she noted useful things, filed and kept. The splinting took 11 minutes. She had done this exactly once before, on a dog when she was 17, and her hands remembered more of it than she'd expected them to. She was not a doctor. She knew the limits of what she was doing: stabilization, not repair, buying time until they could get him to an actual physician. But stabilization, done right, was the difference between a man who reached Abilene, able to see a doctor, and a man who didn't. Told Dex before she did the worst of it, as promised. He made a sound and then was quiet. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at her work. Not the look of someone who is satisfied, but the look of someone who is honestly assessing whether what they've done is enough. That'll hold, Cole said. It'll hold for the road, she said. He needs a real doctor in Abilene. He'll have one. Dex opened his eyes. He looked at the splinted leg and then at Lillian, and the look on his face was not gratitude exactly. It was too immediate for gratitude, too close to the pain and the shock. But it was the look of a man who understands that something necessary was done for him, without calculation and without condition. Thank you, he said. His voice was rough. Don't thank me, she said. Thank your horse for not landing on you. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if it hadn't hurt too much to fully form. Getting Dex into the wagon was a four-man operation involving a makeshift stretcher and a significant amount of carefully coordinated effort, and it meant that Lillian spent the rest of that night and the following day sleeping on a folded horse blanket under the wagon rather than in her usual bunk, because the bunk was now occupied by a man who needed to be kept still and level. The arrangement required adjustment. She moved the sourdough starter to the front of the wagon, where she could access it without climbing over anything, reorganized the supply boxes to create a clear path from the wagon's rear door to Dex's position, and made sure Tobias understood that his bunk was now also unavailable, and that he was sleeping where she'd been sleeping. Tobias looked at the folded horse blanket under the wagon. That's not, he started. It's fine, she said, it's not fine. You've been doing this for 39 days, and now you're sleeping on the ground. Because, Tobias, she looked at him directly. What would you have me do? He stopped. He needed the space, she said. I have the space to give. That's all there is to it. He thought about this seriously, the way she'd come to expect from him that 15-year-old seriousness that was still figuring out what its principles were by testing them against actual situations. I'll take every other night on the ground, he said, so it's fair. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. We'll alternate. That night she slept on the folded horse blanket under the wagon and listened to the sounds of the camp. And Dex's occasional adjustments in the bunk above her. He was trying not to move, and every movement was involuntary and cost him something. And she thought about the word fair and what it meant to a 15-year-old who was still building the architecture of his own character. She thought it was a promising word coming from him. The 39th day's events changed something in the camp that she could feel but not easily describe. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody made a speech. But there was a shift in how the men moved around the chuck wagon, a slightly wider berth given to Lillian's workspace, a slightly quicker response when she needed something fetched or lifted. Not deference, exactly. More like the quiet, practical acknowledgement of someone whose capacity has been more fully measured and found to be larger than originally estimated. Voss noticed this, too. She could tell by the way his eyes moved across the camp in the evenings, the particular attention of a man reassessing the terrain he's trying to navigate. He hadn't made another direct approach since she'd walked away from the camp stool conversation. She didn't know if that was patience or recalculation, and she suspected it was both. On the 40th day, Cole told her they were 6 days from Abilene. She did the food calculation in the wagon that evening, a careful one, knowing she couldn't resupply again before the railhead. She was short on coffee and running low on the dried beans, but the cornmeal supply was still adequate, and she had enough sourdough strength to carry the bread through to the end. She wrote the figures in the log with the matter-of-fact attention of a person who has learned not to catastrophize numbers. You looked at what was real, you worked with what was real, and you didn't borrow disaster from the future before it arrived. Dex from his bunk said, "What are you writing?" Food supply log. Every night? Every night since the first one. A pause. That's 40 days of records. 40 days of records, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, processing this through the haze of pain and enforced stillness. Voss doesn't do that kind of thing, he said. He runs it in his head. I know. What happens if his head and your records disagree? She looked up from the log. In the dim lantern light of the wagon interior, Dex's face was drawn and tired but alert, the sharpness of a man who, flat on his back with a broken leg, is still paying attention to the things worth paying attention to. Then we find out whose numbers hold up, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Put me down as a witness, he said. Comes to that, she looked at him. I heard things, he said, from Voss, before the drive, about what he planned to do with your share. He shifted, winced. I should have said something then. But I needed the work, and he signed my wages. He held her gaze. I'm saying it now. The lamplight moved with the wagon's small sway and cast the shadows around differently every few seconds, so that his face appeared alternately clear and obscured in the way honest things sometimes look in moments of actual consequence, not clear and lit from all angles, but partial, shadowed at the edges, with enough light to see the thing that matters. I hear you, she said. She wrote his name in the back of the log, not in the supply columns, in the margin, where she kept the other kind of notes, the ones about what she'd seen and when and who had been there to see it with her. 6 days to Abilene. She closed the log and fed the starter and lay down on her folded horse blanket in the dark under the wagon, listening to the night sounds of the Kansas plain, and did not sleep for a long time. Cracked wheel spoke held. It held through 2 more draws, a half day of soft ground that grabbed at the wheels and pulled sideways with every revolution, and a rocky crossing that made Tobias wince visibly each time the wagon dropped into a rut. Lillian drove those 6 days with her attention split between the team, the terrain, and the sound of the wheel, a specific listening, the kind that becomes almost involuntary once you've tuned to a frequency, where every creak and shift of the wagon gets filtered automatically for the particular sound that would mean the spokes had finally given way. It didn't give way. She wasn't grateful exactly. Gratitude implied the wheel had made a choice, which it hadn't. It was pine pitch and wrapping wire and her own assessment of what the wood could bear, and it held because she'd been right about those things. There was satisfaction in that, which was different from gratitude and more durable. Dex, riding in the wagon bunk for the last 6 days of the drive, had become a fixture of the interior landscape. His voice, his occasional dry observations about the terrain they were crossing, as visible through the wagon's rear gap, his careful management of a leg that hurt him every time the wheel found a rut. He didn't complain. He wasn't the complaining kind, and also he understood, in the plain way of men who've worked outdoors their whole lives, that complaining about pain doesn't reduce it. He ate what she brought him, slept when the pain permitted it, and talked when the conversation was worth having. On the 5th of the 6 days, he told her more about what he'd heard. It was mid-afternoon, the camp already forming in her mind as a destination, rather than a future abstraction she could calculate now with real precision, the way you can only calculate when you're close enough to count the days on one hand. Tobias was riding the lead horse. Lillian was on the wagon seat. She could hear Dex adjusting in the bunk behind her, the specific sound of a man repositioning himself around an injury. Voss talked to his man, the tall one. Harker the night before the drive left, Dex said. I was in the supply tent. They didn't know I was there. Kept her eyes on the team. He said he'd give you 2 weeks before you quit. Maybe 3 if you were stubborn. Said the wagon was in bad enough shape that any competent person would recognize it was unworkable and walk away. He paused. When you didn't walk away, he started on the paperwork. He had an attorney in Abilene, already, a man named Croft. Plant was to arrive at the railhead with documentation showing the chuck wagon operation had run over budget, damaged the cooperative's reputation with buyers, and constituted a breach of the partnership terms. On what basis? He was going to say you'd made purchasing decisions without authorization. Cutters crossing resupply, which was within the allocated budget. His attorney was going to argue the allocation didn't cover the items you bought, that you'd exceeded the scope of your authority as a partner in the cattle, not in the operations. Dex shifted it again. It's thin, but thin is enough if the other person doesn't have anyone to say otherwise. She thought about the log. 40 days of receipts entries and daily records, written in her own hand and witnessed, in a practical sense, by every man on the drive who had eaten the food those purchases produced. He was also going to argue, Dex continued, that your presence on the drive had disrupted normal operations, created tensions among the crew. Had it? A pause that she could feel rather than hear. Not the kind he meant, Dex said. But he doesn't need the truth to write it in a document. She drove in silence for a quarter mile. The Kansas grass moved in a long, slow wave ahead of them, south wind steady. the kind that had been their companion for the last week and had kept the trail dust moving sideways instead of into faces. He underestimated the log, she said finally. What? Planned all of it without accounting for the log, because he assumed a young widow running a chuck wagon she'd been given as an insult wouldn't be keeping a day-by-day documented record of every supply decision, every expense, every transaction. She looked at the horizon. He saw what he expected to see, not what was actually there. Another silence from the bunk. Yeah, Dex said. That's what he did. Abilene appeared on the 42nd day as a smudge of smoke on the horizon that gradually resolved over the course of a morning's travel into buildings, livestock pens, the sound of a town that existed for the specific purpose of receiving cattle at the end of long journeys. The railheads and smell reached them before the town did cattle and coal smoke, and the particular density of a place processing large quantities of both and the herd, moving in its last miles, seemed to recognize something in the air, cattle shifting and bunching with the restless energy of animals who sense a destination, even if they can't articulate what it means. Lillian guided the wagon through the outskirts of town with her jaw set and her hands steady. Tobias rode the lead horse with a straightness in his back she hadn't seen on the first day. Dex, behind her in the bunk, had levered himself into something approaching a sitting position, using the wagon's side rail as a prop, because he'd said he'd be damned if he arrived in Abilene lying down. The main cattle yards were on the north side of town, and Voss had arranged meeting with the buyers for the following morning. Tonight was staging the herd into the holding pens. The crew to a boarding house Voss had prearranged, the wagon to the equipment yard on the east side of the stock operation. Cole appeared at the wagon's side as they pulled into the equipment yard. Get Dex to the doctor on Front Street, he said. I'll have one of the men take him on the wagon. I can take him. You've got the wagon to secure. I can do both. He looked at her. The particular look she'd learned over 42 days, not skepticism, but recalibration. The ongoing process of updating his estimate of what she meant when she said she could do something. All right, he said. She took Dex to the doctor. The doctor, a compact, brisk man who communicated primarily through economy of movement, examined the splinted leg with the careful attention of someone looking for what someone else had done right as much as what they'd done wrong. He probed, assessed, and then looked at Lillian with a slightly adjusted expression. How long since the break? 5 days, she said. 6, counting today, and you splinted it yourself. Yes. He looked at the splint again. The alignment is better than it has any right to be, given the circumstances. He said it without warmth, but also without the condescension she'd expected. Just accurate. He'll need 6 weeks off the leg, possibly 8. The bone has started to set. We don't want to interfere with that now. Dex, sitting on the examination table, looked at the ceiling. 6 weeks, he said, at minimum. I've got work. You've got a broken leg, the doctor said. The work will still be there. Lillian paid the examination fee from her own pocket, not from the wagon fund, which was the cooperative's money, but from the separate small fold of bills she'd carried in the book cover alongside the partnership deed. She'd budgeted for unexpected expenses from the first day, because unexpected expenses were the one thing you could always budget for on a long journey, not their specific form, but their existence. Dex looked at her when she paid. I'll pay you back, he said. When you're back on your feet, she said. Not before. He held her gaze for a moment with the specific expression of a man who is holding something back that he hasn't yet found the right words for. Thank you, he said. The same words as before, but different in weight. She nodded and went back to secure the wagon. The boarding house Voss had arranged was a large, plain establishment, run by a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had the organized calm of someone who had been processing large numbers of trail-dirty men for long enough to have systematized every aspect of it. She showed Lillian to a room on the second floor, a real room, with a real bed and a window and a wash basin, and left her to it without ceremony. Lillian stood in the middle of the room for a full minute without doing anything. 42 days. The last time she'd been in a real room, Daniel had been alive. She'd left for the drive from the ranch house that had stopped feeling like home the day he didn't come back from the corral, and she was standing now in a boarding house room in a cattle town at the end of the longest 6 weeks of her life, with a legal battle likely starting in the morning and a log book under her arm and pine pitch still faintly embedded in the skin around her nails. She sat on the bed. The mattress was soft in a way she'd forgotten mattresses could be, and the sensation was so foreign after 42 nights on a wagon bunk and then a horse blanket on the ground that she had to focus for a moment to locate herself properly. She sat there for about 4 minutes. Then she got up, washed her face and hands, changed her clothes, put the log under the mattress where it was accessible but not visible, and went downstairs to eat whatever misses. Aldrich was serving for supper. Voss's attorney was already in Abilene. She found this out from Cole, who came to the boarding house at 7 the following morning with 2 cups of coffee and the direct manner of a man who has decided that the time for managing information carefully has passed. Croft arrived 2 days ago, he said. He's been at the cattle buyer's hotel. I don't know what Voss has told him or what paperwork he's already filed, but the meeting this morning is not just a cattle sale. It's a setup. Tell me what you know about the buyers. Brothers, Elliot and Marcus Witt. Kansas City money, they buy large herds for resale to the eastern markets. They're serious businessmen. They don't like complications, and they don't like disorder. Voss is betting that they'll see the situation with you as a complication inside, with whoever offers the clearest path to a clean transaction. And if I show them the log? If you can get in front of them with it, yes. But the meeting is Voss's meeting. He controls the room. Cole turned his cup in his hands. Unless someone else is in the room who has standing to speak. She looked at him. I'm the trail boss, he said. I have standing to speak to the condition of the herd and the operation. That's my professional role. And what would you say? He was quiet for a beat. The particular quiet she'd learned to distinguish from his other quiets. This one was not hesitation, but gathering. The way a person gathers themselves before saying something that commits them. I'd say the herd came in better condition than any drive I've run in 7 years, he said. And I'd say why. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands. That's going to cost you, she said. Voss will not forgive it. I know. He controls who he hires for the next drive. Probably the drive after that. I know that too. She looked up. He met her eyes with the direct steadiness she'd come to recognize as simply how he looked when he wasn't managing anything, when the thing he was doing was the thing he actually meant. Why, she said. A pause. Because it's what's true, he said. And because I've spent enough years in rooms where the true thing wasn't said, because it was inconvenient for someone with more power than me. He set his cup down. I'm tired of that room. She thought about him at the back of every meal line for 7 years. About the covered plate that nobody else had thought to set aside. About a farm with 8 children and a mother who gave the best portion to someone who acted like it just appeared. All right, she said. The meeting was at 9 o'clock in the front room of the Abilene Cattlemen's Exchange, a long, wide-boarded room that smelled of cigar smoke and financial ambition. Furnished with a table large enough to seat 8 and chairs that communicated authority through mass and dark wood. Elliot and Marcus Witt were already seated when Voss arrived, and the Witt brothers were the kind of men whose wealth had reached the point of becoming invisible, not displayed in jewelry or loudness, but in the complete absence of anxiety. They had the settled quality of people for whom this transaction was one of several happening simultaneously. Voss had brought his attorney, Croft and Harker. He had not invited Lillian. Came anyway. She walked into the room 3 minutes after the meeting started, when the introductory courtesies were still underway, and nobody had yet said anything that could be called a formal opening. She had the log under her arm and the partnership deed in her coat pocket, and she took a chair at the far end of the table and said pleasantly, "Good morning. I'm Lillian Hayes. I hold a quarter share of the Voss Cattlemen's Cooperative, and I'm a party to this transaction." The room absorbed this. Elliot Witt, the older of the two, gray at his temples, with the quiet attention of a man who processes new information by watching rather than speaking, looked at her with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile. It was evaluative, the expression of someone who has encountered an unexpected variable and is determining its significance. Marcus Witt looked at Voss. Voss looked at Lillian with the particular flatness of a man who has just had his plan complicated in a way he cannot immediately correct for. Croft, the attorney, leaned toward Voss and said something in a murmur that Lillian couldn't hear. Voss listened, nodded slightly, and then said, with a controlled pleasantness that cost him something to produce, Mrs. Hayes, this meeting is a business negotiation between the cooperative and the Witt interests. It's not the appropriate venue for a partner in the cooperative, she said. I'd be interested in the legal basis for that position. Mr. Croft may be able to provide it. Croft looked at the table. The Witt brothers looked at each other in the brief, calibrated way of two people who have worked together long enough to communicate in gestures. Marcus Witt said, "What's the nature of the dispute?" "There's no dispute," Voss said. "Mrs." Marcus Witt said, turning to her. "There is a dispute," she said, "about the accounting of cooperative expenses and their application against my partnership share before distribution." She put the log on the table, kept a complete record of the chuck wagon supply expenses for the duration of the drive. Every purchase, every receipt, every transaction. I'd be happy to have it examined by anyone in this room. Elliot Witt looked at the log. Then he looked at Lillian. Then for a longer moment he looked at Voss. Cole Maddox walked in. Came through the door with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided what he's doing and isn't second-guessing it, and he took the remaining chair at the table without being invited and said, "To the room in general, I'm Cole Maddox, trail boss for the Voss Cooperative Drive. I believe my professional assessment of the operation is relevant to this discussion." Voss went very still. Harker, standing at the room's edge, looked at Cole with an expression that shifted through several stages rapidly, ending somewhere around the realization that the landscape had changed in a way nobody had briefed him on. Marcus Witt said, "Please." Cole looked at the Witt brothers with the same directness he'd applied to everything Lillian had watched him do for 42 days. He didn't perform it, he just said it. "This herd came in better physical condition than any I've driven in 7 years," he said. "Cattle gained weight on the trail, which is unusual, and which any buyer can verify by examining them. The crew completed a 42-day drive through severe weather, a partial stampede, a major river crossing, and the loss of an experienced rider to injury, and arrived without losing a single additional head after the storm scatter." He paused. "Primary reason for those outcomes, including crew health, morale, and sustained performance under difficult conditions, was the management of the chuck wagon." Elliot Witt had stopped moving. "The chuck wagon that misses. Hayes took over with spoiled supplies and broken equipment." Cole continued, "and turned into something that fed 30 men twice a day for 42 days, on a budget that came in within the allocated figures, and produced a crew that was, by the time we reached Abilene, performing above what any drive I've managed has produced." He looked at Voss once, briefly. "That's my professional assessment," he said. "I'll answer questions if the gentlemen have them." Marcus had questions. He was the talker of the two. Elliot was the one who watched and decided. Marcus was the one who assembled the information Elliot used to decide. He asked Cole about the storm, about the river crossing, about the scatter recovery, about the condition of the cattle at specific points in the drive. He asked careful, specific questions that demonstrated he had been buying cattle at railheads long enough to know exactly what questions revealed about an operation. Cole answered each one with the same economy he applied to everything, accurately, without editorializing, and without looking at Voss. Voss, across the table, held himself very still with the particular rigidity of a man watching something he'd built carefully come apart at a seam he hadn't reinforced. Croft, the attorney, attempted twice to redirect the conversation toward the accounting dispute. Both times, Elliot Witt raised one hand slightly from the table, not dramatically, just a small, definitive gesture, and Croft stopped talking. When Marcus Witt finished with Cole, he turned to Lillian. "The log," he said. "May I?" She slid it across the table. He read it with the concentrated attention of someone who is actually reading, not performing reading. It took 6 minutes. Elliot looked over his brother's shoulder for the last 2 of those minutes. They didn't speak to each other while they read. Elliot looked up first. He looked at Voss. "The expenses are within the allocated budget," he said. It wasn't a question. Voss said, "There's a question about the scope of minus." "Within the budget," Elliot said again. Still not a question. The second repetition was not for clarity. It was a signal. Croft made one more attempt. "The partnership deed's provisions regarding operational authority." "We've seen the deed," Marcus said. "Mrs. Hayes provided a copy this morning through the county clerk's office." Lillian had sent Tobias to the clerk's office before 7 o'clock that morning with a written request for the filed copy of the deed. Clerk had provided it within 20 minutes. Small towns near railheads were efficient at this kind of thing. They processed legal documents constantly and had systems for it. Voss looked at her. It was not the look of a man who is angry. Anger, she'd learned, was for situations where a person still believed they had options. This was something else, the specific, flat expression of a man who has just understood that the ground he thought he was standing on was not solid. She held his gaze, not with hostility, and not with the pleasure of winning, because she'd learned early in her life that there was a kind of victory that poisoned you if you enjoyed it too much, just steadily, evenly. Gentlemen, Elliot Witt said, pulling the conversation back into his own hands, with the ease of a man accustomed to doing so, I'd like to see the herd before we discuss price. The herd inspection took 2 hours. The Witt brothers walked the holding pens with the slow, systematic attention of men who had been reading cattle since before they could read documents, pressing flanks, checking eyes, examining hooves, speaking to each other in the minimal shorthand of long collaboration. Cole walked with them. Lillian stayed at the pen's rail. Voss stayed beside her. They stood in silence for several minutes. The sounds of the stockyard cattle, handlers, the distant percussion of the rail operation filled the space where neither of them spoke. Then Voss said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You understand you've created a problem for this operation that will outlast this sale." She looked at the herd. "I understand that you created a problem," she said, "when you decided that what belonged to me was something you were entitled to take because you thought I was too young and too alone to protect it." A pause. "I gave you the wagon in good faith," he said, turned and looked at him directly. "You gave me the wagon with spoiled flour and a leaking barrel and equipment you knew was failing, in front of 30 men, so that I would fail publicly and you could use that failure to justify taking my inheritance at a price you'd already decided before I arrived at camp." She held his gaze. "Don't tell me it was good faith. You're better than that, and so am I." He said nothing. She turned back to the herd. "I'm going to receive my full share of this sale," she said, "and the accounting is going to reflect the actual expenses, not the inflated version your attorney was preparing. And if there's any attempt to vary from those terms, the log, the deed, the county filing, and the testimony of your own trail boss will be available to whoever needs to see them." Another silence. "What do you want?" he said. And for the first time in the entire 42 days she'd known him, the calculation was absent from his voice. He was just asking. She thought about it honestly, because the question deserved an honest answer rather than a tactical one. "My quarter share at the fair market price this herd commands today. Nothing more and nothing less than what Daniel's deed entitles me to." She paused. "And a written acknowledgement from the cooperative that the chuck wagon expenses were within budget and properly authorized. Because I don't want this conversation to happen again." He was quiet for a long time. The Witt brothers had stopped at a cluster of cattle near the pen center and were conferring in low voices, both of them looking at a large steer, with the concentrated attention of men arriving at a number. "All right," Voss said. She hadn't expected it that quickly. She'd expected more resistance, more repositioning, some version of a counter that she'd have to answer. The flatness of his agreement caught her slightly off balance, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she'd been braced for a fight that had, in its most important sense, already ended. "The letter from the buyers," she said. "Was it real?" A long pause. "No," he said. She nodded. That was all she needed to know. The Witt brothers made their offer at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a fair offer, not a generous one, because the Witt brothers had not built their operation on generosity, but a fair one, reflecting actual market conditions and the genuine quality of the herd they'd inspected. Elliot delivered the number, and Marcus watched Voss's face while he did it. Lillian did the math in her head before anyone had stopped moving. She'd been doing this math, in various projected forms, for 6 weeks, and the actual number landed exactly in the range she'd calculated. The negotiation that followed was Voss's territory, and she let him have it. He was a competent negotiator. And the final number the room landed on, after 40 minutes of measured back and forth, was better than the opening offer by a margin that was worth the 40 minutes. She did not interrupt or interject. She watched Elliot Witt, who spent the negotiation watching the room with the settled attention of a man for whom this specific transaction was one of many, and whose final number had been established before they sat down. When the agreement was reached, Marcus Witt produced papers. Voss signed. Then Lillian, as the second named partner, signed where her name appeared because Cole had told her that morning that the Witt brothers operated on partnership deeds as written and not as interpreted, and that their Kansas City attorney had looked at the deed copy and confirmed the quarter share was hers to sign for. Croft, Voss's attorney, signed as witness with the expression of a man who has spent an afternoon watching a plan dissolve and is now performing his professional function anyway. When the papers were finished, Elliot Witt looked at Lillian. "The log," he said. "Did you keep one on every aspect of the operation, or only the supplies?" "Only the supplies," she said, "though I kept informal notes on other things. Crew management, the medical decisions, the fire during the storm, He said these things flatly, as information rather than praise. Maddox described them. Maddox described what happened, she said. I just did what the job required. Elliot looked at her for a moment, with the expression of a man who has encountered fewer people than he'd like, who say that particular thing and mean it. My brother and I are expanding our operation, he said. We're building supply infrastructure for the next 3 drives north 2 from Texas, 1 from the New Mexico territory. We're looking for people who can manage provisioning at the operational level. He paused. If you have any interest in a conversation about that, I'm at the Drovers Hotel through Thursday. She looked at him. She looked at Marcus, who was watching her with a similar expression, not the evaluative look of the morning, but something that had moved past evaluation into something more settled. She thought about the wagon, the starter crock in its corner, the log with 42 days of entries, Tobias riding the lead horse with his back straight, Dex in the bunk saying, "Put me down as a witness," Cole taking himself out of the back of the serving line. "I'll be there Wednesday morning," she said. Elliot Witt nodded once and gathered his papers. That evening, the crew ate their last meal together. It was not the chuck wagon. The wagon was in the equipment yard, and the crew was spread between the boarding house and 2 other establishments along Front Street, but Lillian had arranged, through Mrs. Aldrich, for the boarding house's back room to be available for the purpose. She'd spent the afternoon in the kitchen with Mrs. Aldrich's tolerant permission, using a real stove for the first time in 42 days, and what she produced was not trail food. It was a real meal: roasted meat, proper bread, preserved vegetables that Mrs. Aldrich kept in a root cellar, a pot of beans that had actual time to cook properly rather than the quick versions she'd been managing for weeks. The men came in 1s and 2s, trail dirty in the specific way that 6 weeks of outdoor work accumulates past the reach of a single wash, and they ate with the concentrated pleasure of people who have been eating adequately for a long time and are now eating well. Dex was carried in on a chair by Garrett and Peter, ungainly, slightly chaotic, with Dex directing the operation in a tone that was trying to be irritated and failing, and installed at the table where he could reach the food without moving his leg. Tobias sat beside Lillian without being told to, which was not something he'd have done at the drive's beginning, and ate 3 servings of bread without appearing to count them. Ira from Missouri had a 4th serving of the roasted meat and did not apologize for it. Cole arrived last, as he had every night on the trail, but this time it was last because he'd been in a conversation outside, not because he was waiting for everyone else to finish. Came in and found the room already full, and a chair left beside Lillian at the table end. He sat in it. She had already eaten. She was drinking coffee and watching the room. "How did you know about the Witt brothers and the deed?" she asked. "I sent a wire to their Kansas City office 2 days before we reached Abilene," he said. "Asked what their standard practice was for partnership disputes in cattle sales. They wired back within a day." She looked at him. "When did you decide to do that?" 37th day, he said. "After Voss came to your wagon with the ledger page." She thought about the night on the 37th day when he'd come to tell her what Voss was planning. He'd already sent the wire before that conversation. He'd already decided before he told her what he knew. "You didn't mention the wire," she said. "I wasn't sure it would produce anything useful. I didn't want to tell you something that might not matter." He looked at the table. "I should have told you anyway." "Yes," she said. "You should have." A pause. "I'm still learning," he said. "How to tell people things that might help them instead of waiting until I'm certain." She looked at him for a moment. There was, she thought, a long way between the man who had spent 7 years letting his trail boss's conscience be managed by what was convenient for Clayton Voss, and the man who had walked into the Cattlemen's Exchange that morning and said what was true. It was not a small distance. "You did it today," she said. "Counts." He looked at the room full of men eating. Something in his face had the quality of a person who is seeing a familiar landscape from a slightly different elevation, the same terrain, but with enough new height to understand things about it that weren't visible from below. "The Witt brothers," he said. "Wednesday morning. You heard I was at the pen rail." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He offered you work too," she said, not a guess. A pause that was its own answer. "He asked if I was under contract with the cooperative for the return drive," Cole said. "I told him the contract was for the northward drive and was concluded at the railhead." "And?" He looked at her sidelong, and he gave me a card with the hotel address on it. She thought about that. She thought about 42 days, and a covered plate set beside a fire, and a man who had spent a long time believing the leftover portion was what he deserved. Wednesday morning, she said. Wednesday morning, he said. The room around them was loud in the specific way of people who have done something hard together and are now on the other side of it, not celebrating exactly, but released. The particular ease of people who have been braced against something for a long time and have just finally been allowed to unbrace. Garrett was telling a story that required more hand gestures than the table space easily accommodated. Peter was laughing at something Tobias had said. Dex was eating with the focused attention of a man for whom eating without pain was still novel enough to deserve real appreciation. Lillian looked at all of it. She thought about the morning 42 days ago when she'd stood in the spring camp dust with a coffee cup in her hand, and 30 men laughing at a verdict that was supposed to break her. She thought about pine pitch and wrapping wire, about a sourdough starter that Pearl had kept alive for 17 years and given away without condition. About the way necessary things got done quietly daily, without fanfare, by people who understood that the work was the point and the recognition was secondary. Thought about Daniel, who had filed a deed with the county clerk without telling her, because he'd known her well enough to know that she'd need it, and hadn't known how to tell her that he'd known. She missed him. She let herself miss him, in the room full of noise and food, and the particular warmth of people who had come through something together. Then she picked up her coffee cup and turned to Cole and said, "Tell me what you're thinking about doing next." He looked at her with that same directness, that look he'd stopped managing, somewhere between the 30th and 35th day, and had started just using. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I've been working for a man I shouldn't have been working for longer than I should have been working for him, and that the Witt brothers appear to be a different kind of operation." "They are," she said. "I think they are. And I'm thinking," he continued, more slowly still, "that the kind of work we just completed, the kind where things that are supposed to fail don't, because someone was paying attention, is the kind of work I'd like to do more of." She looked at him. She said, not a correction, just noting the word. He noticed her, noting it. His expression shifted not toward the guarded blankness, but away from it, in the direction of something less managed. "We," he said deliberately this time. The room was still loud around them. Tobias had knocked over his water cup and was mopping it up with theatrical despair. Dex was laughing at something Ira had said, which was unexpected from both of them. The food was mostly gone, and the coffee was still circulating, and the evening was doing what evenings do when they're ending well, slowing, softening, settling into something worth keeping. Outside, Abilene was doing its loud, practical business of turning the end of one journey into the beginning of the logistics of the next. Lillian drank her coffee and stayed in her chair and let the room be what it was. Wednesday morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows several days of Kansas, when the sky a hard pale blue and the air carrying just enough chill to make a person walk purposefully rather than drift. Lillian was at the Drovers Hotel at 8 o'clock, which was an hour before she'd said she would be, because she'd been awake since 5 and had used the extra hours to do something she hadn't done in 43 days. Sit with the log and write a clean summary of it. Not for the Witt brothers, they'd already seen it. For herself. A record of what the drive had actually cost, what it had produced, and what the difference between the two numbers meant in plain language. She wrote it in the back pages of the log, behind the supply columns, in the same careful hand she'd used for every entry. She was not sure why she needed it written down. She knew the numbers. But there was something about seeing it summarized the distance from the first morning, with the spoiled flour and the leaking barrel to the pen rail in Abilene, where Elliot Witt had watched the herd and asked who had kept the crew alive, that she needed to hold in her hands as a physical thing, rather than only in her memory. She folded the log closed and went to the hotel. Cole was already there. He was sitting in the hotel lobby with his hat on his knee, which was where she'd expected to find him, because she'd learned over 42 days that Cole Maddox's relationship with punctuality was the same as his relationship with everything else he considered a professional commitment absolute. He looked up when she came in and said nothing, which was also expected, and they went together to the meeting room, where Elliot and Marcus Witt were already seated with coffee and papers. The conversation that followed was not a negotiation in the adversarial sense. It was more like two sets of people comparing what they knew and arriving at an arrangement based on what the comparison revealed. Elliot talked about the expansion 3 drives, provisioning infrastructure, supply chain management across a longer haul than the Chisholm run. Marcus talked about what they'd seen in the herd and what it told them about operational management. They both listened to Cole describe the trail in the specific terms of a man who had run it for 7 years, understood where it was hard and where it had margin. Then Elliot looked at Lillian and asked what she saw as the central problem in trail provisioning. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about actual problems, not the answer she thought he wanted, but the true one. Planning for the human factor, she said. Food isn't just fuel on a long drive. It's the thing that holds the human element of the operation together when everything else is trying to pull it apart. Most drives plan for the cattle and treat the crew as a secondary consideration. Crew is not secondary. The crew is what keeps the cattle moving. Elliot looked at Marcus. Marcus said, "That's exactly what we've been telling our operations manager for 2 years." The terms they agreed on were fairer than Lillian had expected, and more specific than she'd have designed herself. She would manage supply and provisioning planning for the 3 drives, working from a base at a new cooperative depot the Witt brothers were establishing at a river crossing, midway between the Texas ranges and the Kansas railhead. Cole would take the trail boss position on the first drive, with the option to continue on the subsequent 2, depending on how the first unfolded. She signed the agreement with the same pen she'd used to sign the cattle sale papers. Her hand was steady. Cole signed after her. When the Witt brothers had gone to their next meeting, Cole and Lillian sat in the empty room for a moment with the papers in front of them and the morning light coming through the window at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made it visible. "How do you feel?" he said. She considered the question honestly. "Like I don't entirely trust it yet." "That's probably wise." "Not distrust of them," she said. "Just the habit of waiting for the thing to be taken away. It takes time to stop waiting for that." He looked at the papers. "Yeah," he said, "it does." She went back to the ranch before anything else. This was not practical. The practical thing would have been to stay in Abilene and begin the work immediately. And Elliot Witt had said as much, pleasantly, without pressure. But she needed to go back to the place where Daniel had died and where the sourdough starter had begun its journey, and she needed to do that before she could fully turn toward whatever came next. She couldn't explain this to anyone in a way that would have made sense logically, so she didn't try. She told the Witt brothers she'd be back within the month. They accepted this without requiring an explanation, which told her something good about them. Tobias rode back with her as far as the Hargrove Ranch, which was on the route south and where Pearl was. He wasn't going home. He had no particular home to go to, which was something she'd learned gradually over 42 days. In the way you learn things about people when you live in close quarters and the small facts accumulate. He'd hired onto the drive from a work camp outside Abilene the previous spring, and before that he'd been drifting. And before that there was a family situation he'd described once, obliquely, and not again. She'd thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since the 30th day. At the Hargrove Ranch turnoff, she stopped the wagon and said, "Pearl Hargrove runs a working ranch with a cook's position open. I know because she told me when I went to see her before the drive. If you want, I can give you a letter of introduction." Tobias looked at the road, then at her. "Why would you take me?" he said. "I'm 15 and I've been a cook's assistant for 6 weeks. "Because I'll tell her what you can do," she said. "And because she's the kind of woman who values what's real over what looks good on paper." She paused. "You're good at this work, Tobias. Not perfect, you still burn the coffee when you're not paying attention, but good. That's worth something." He was quiet for a moment. "You could come work for the Witt operation," he said. "When it's going." She looked at him. He was 16 in 3 months, and he'd arrived at the drive as a punishment and left it as something else. And in the 6 weeks between those 2 points he'd developed from a sullen, self-pitying boy into someone who alternated between genuine competence and the usual catastrophic overconfidence of a teenager, which was exactly where he should be at his age. She felt something about him that she couldn't have predicted on the first morning, a specific form of investment, the kind you develop for people you've watched become better. "Write to me when you're settled," she said. "We'll talk about it then." He took the letter she'd written the night before and rode toward the Hargrove Ranch without looking back, which was the right way to go somewhere you'd decided to go. He drove south. Pearl was at the kitchen table when Lillian arrived, which was where Pearl always seemed to be, as if the kitchen table were a fixed point around which the rest of the ranch orbited. She looked up, looked at Lillian, looked at the wagon visible through the window, and said, "Sit down. I'll make coffee." "I can make—" "Sit," Pearl said, and produced the coffee with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding people for so long that hospitality had become purely reflexive. Lillian sat. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint, warm sourness of fermentation, someone else's starter working somewhere in the room, and Lillian felt something settle in her chest at the smell of it. She gave Pearl the accounting of the drive in the direct, unfussy way she'd have given anyone a fair report. What had happened, what it had cost, what had been resolved. Pearl listened without interrupting, which was a skill that Lillian had come to understand was rarer than it should be. When she'd finished, Pearl refilled both cups and said, "And the starter?" "Still alive," Lillian said. "Still going." Pearl made a sound of satisfaction that was entirely genuine, and not at all about the cattle or the sale or Clayton Voss or the Witt brothers or any of the things that had seemed so enormous for the past 6 weeks. It was about the starter, and it was the right response, because the starter was the right unit of measure for what had actually mattered on the drive. "I'm going back to the ranch," Lillian said, "before I go north to work for the Witt operation. I need to close it up properly." "Sell it?" She'd been thinking about this since Abilene. She still wasn't certain. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to see it first." Pearl nodded. "That's honest." "I might rent it. There's good land there. Daniel's spent years on that land." She turned her cup in her hands. "I'm not ready to be the person who sells it. You might not ever be that person." "No," she said. "Maybe not." The ranch looked smaller than she remembered. This happened, she'd been told, when you went away from a place for a long time. The place contracted slightly in your imagination. The scale revised itself against everything you'd since. The house was still there. The outbuildings were still standing. The corral gate was still the gate that hadn't been properly repaired in time. She'd arranged for a neighbor to check on the property during the drive, and he'd done what she asked. The stock that remained had been watered and fed. The house had been checked weekly, and nothing had been disturbed. She walked through the house slowly. It smelled like the absence of a person in the specific way that houses do after they've been empty for a while, not unpleasant, just vacant in a way that had its own particular note. She went through the rooms in order, the way you walk through a place you've known, not looking for anything specific, but allowing herself to look at everything. Daniel's study. The tin box under the floorboard, empty now, the deed long since filed and used for exactly the purpose he'd intended it for, stood in the study for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be loved by someone who had prepared for your survival, without telling you he was preparing for it, who had understood that the world was going to require her to fight for things that should have been straightforwardly hers, and had tried to arm her for that fight without making the arming feel like a burden. That was a particular kind of love, not the demonstrative kind, not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that did the work quietly and left the tools where they could be found. She'd been angry at first, a little, that he hadn't told her, that she'd had to find the deed herself in a tin box after he was gone. She understood now that telling her would have meant telling her he expected to die, which he hadn't known how to do without breaking something that didn't need to be broken before it had to be. She was not angry anymore. She sat in his chair for a few minutes. Then she got up and went to check on the cookbook. The starter crock she'd brought north and back was on the kitchen counter. She'd traveled 42 days with it, through a storm and a river crossing, and the specific daily chaos of a cattle drive. And it had survived all of it because she'd fed it every morning regardless of what else was happening. She fed it now in the kitchen where it had started, using the same flour from the same pantry shelf that Daniel had helped her stock the autumn before he died. She stood at the kitchen counter with her hands in the mixture and felt not peace exactly, because peace implied the absence of difficulty. And she was not naive enough to think the difficulty was done, but something related to peace. Particular quality of a person who has found their footing in a landscape that tried to shift under them. Spent 4 days at the ranch. She settled the remaining accounts, arranged a rental agreement with the neighbor who'd been watching the property a fair term, fair price, with a clause that preserved her right to return, and packed what she needed to take north. Cookbook went into the trunk. The deed copy stayed in the cookbook. The starter crock, carefully wrapped and padded, went into a separate crate she'd built for it, specifically, because 42 days had taught her that the starter needed to be treated like infrastructure and not like a luxury. On the last evening, she sat on the porch and looked at the Texas landscape going dark around the edges as the sun went down the flat, wide country she'd grown up near, but had never entirely understood until she'd spent 6 weeks looking at Kansas sky and come back to Texas and felt the difference. She thought about what she'd told Elliot Witt about the human factor. about food not being just fuel. She thought about it in the larger sense now, about all the invisible work of feeding and sustaining and caring for the people around you, and how that work was almost never counted in any of the calculations that supposedly determined who was powerful and who wasn't. Voss's calculation had not included it. Most calculations didn't. And yet the 42-day record was right there in the log. The crew performed better. The cattle came in healthier. The entire operation outperformed its own history, because someone had treated the daily work of keeping people fed and cared for as something that mattered as much as anything else. It seemed obvious, stated plainly. It seemed like something anyone should have known. The trouble, she thought, was the gap between knowing something and actually counting it. She stayed on the porch until the stars came out, and then she went inside and slept in her own bed for the last time in a while. Cole met her at the river crossing depot 3 weeks later. The depot was new enough that it still smelled like fresh-cut lumber, a long supply building, 2 smaller structures for equipment, and a bunkhouse that was still being finished on the interior. The Witt brothers had moved efficiently. The first drive was already being organized, cattle assembled in the South Texas ranges and riders hired, and the supply planning that Lillian was responsible for needed to be done before the drive pulled out in 6 weeks. Cole looked the same as he'd looked on the trail, which was to say he looked like himself, trail practical, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who has stopped being somewhere he shouldn't have been and has not yet entirely processed the change. "How was the ranch?" he said. "Smaller than I remembered." "Will you sell it?" "No." She'd known this definitively since the last morning on the porch. "I'll keep renting it. It's good land." He nodded. She'd noticed, over the weeks since Abilene, that he'd developed a different quality of listening, not that he hadn't listened before. But there'd been a layer of management between what he heard and how he received it. That layer was thinner now. She didn't know if it was Abilene or the drive, or the covered plate, or the conversation at 2 a.m. after the storm, or some combination of all of it that didn't have a clean beginning. She didn't ask. Some things didn't need to be named to be real. "The first drive's roster is mostly set," he said. "Maddox has a few recommendations for riders I haven't worked with before." "Maddox?" she said. He registered the slight humor in her tone. "Habit," he said without apology. "Break it," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted in the small, specific way things shifted with him when he'd decided something. "Lillian," he said, "the first drive's roster is mostly set." "Better," she said, and meant it. They went inside to begin the supply planning, which was where the actual work started, and the actual work, she'd learned 42 days worth of times, was never the impressive moment. The impressive moment was what the actual work produced. The work itself was flour and beans and pine pitch and daily feeding, and keeping the fire alive in weather that wanted to kill it. She set the log on the table and opened it to a new page. There's something the frontier doesn't tell you when you're living inside it. It's something you only see from the outside, or from the other side of time when you can look back at a moment that felt like defeat and see it for what it actually was, which was not defeat, which was the setup for something that couldn't have happened any other way. Lillian Hayes was given a broken wagon because a powerful man believed that the worst thing he could offer her was exactly bad enough to break her. He didn't understand, couldn't understand, because he'd spent his entire life measuring people by the wrong thing that she had been training for that wagon her entire life. Every meal she'd ever made under difficult conditions, every supply she'd stretched further than it had a right to stretch, every fire she'd kept alive when it wanted to go out, all of it had been practice for a 6-week trial she hadn't known was coming. That's the thing about being underestimated. It's insulting, and it's painful, and there is nothing noble about the experience of being laughed at. But it does, occasionally, produce a very specific gift, the freedom to work, without anyone watching carefully enough to interfere. She hadn't won because she was exceptional. She'd won because she was prepared, and because she was willing to do the daily work without requiring that it be acknowledged before she did it. That's harder than it sounds. Most people need the acknowledgement first. They need to know the work is being seen before they put everything into it. Lillian had learned, somewhere in her life, from her mother, from Daniel, from the particular education of being a woman in a world that consistently undervalued what women did to put everything in regardless. To do the work as if it mattered, because it mattered. Not because someone was watching. That was the real lesson of the drive. Not that she'd won against Voss. He was one man with one bad plan. The lesson was simpler and harder, that the things that actually keep people alive and functional and human, the daily, unglamorous, invisible work of feeding and caring and sustaining, are worth doing at full effort, whether or not anyone has gotten around to recognizing their value yet. Someone will get around to it, and if they don't, the work still mattered. She thought about her mother's starter, 31 years old when her mother gave it away, kept alive through droughts and floods and the deaths of children. Her mother had never been famous. She had never been celebrated. She had fed her family and her neighbors, and the people who passed through for 3 decades, and the starter had gone on living after she did because she'd taught the right person how to feed it. That was not a small life. That was not a life that failed to matter. The sourdough Lillian had carried north and back was alive in its crate in the supply depot, waiting to be fed in the morning. It would go on the first WIT drive in 6 weeks, in a chuck wagon that was already provisioned with supplies she'd selected with the same attention she'd given every supplies a decision, since Pearl had split the starter with her on a kitchen table 12 miles, east of a spring camp where 30 men had laughed. Tobias was at the Hargrove Ranch. Pearl had written twice brief, efficient letters, the kind Pearl wrote to say he was doing well, learning faster than expected, still occasionally burning the coffee, coming along. She'd written back both times. She'd told him to write when he was ready to talk about what came next. Dex was healing. He'd written a single letter, in the cramped, effortful hand of a man who did not write letters as a general practice, to say that the doctor had confirmed the bone was setting correctly, and that he was making himself useful from a chair, and that he hadn't forgotten he owed her money. She'd written back to say the money could wait, and that she hoped the leg healed straight, and that there would be work available in the fall if he was interested. Cracked wheel spoke, repaired with pine pitch and wrapping wire, had been replaced at the equipment yard in Abilene by a proper wheel at the Witt brothers' expense. She'd watched them do it and had kept the damaged spoke. She wasn't sure why. It was sitting in the bottom of her trunk, wrapped in cloth, next to the cookbook with the deed inside it. Maybe she'd throw it away eventually. Maybe she wouldn't. On the first evening at the depot, after the supply lists were drafted and the preliminary roster was confirmed, and the building had settled into the particular quiet of a new operation, at the end of its first real working day, Cole came to find her at the supply building. She was still at the table, going through the last column of figures. He sat down across from her and said nothing, which she'd stopped needing him to fill. After a while, he said, "Are you happy?" She looked up. It was a simple question, and he'd asked it simply, which was how he asked things now. She'd noticed this over the past weeks, the directness that had always been there, but had previously been managed toward professional topics only. It was less managed now. She thought about it honestly. "I'm not unhappy," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it's closer to the truth than saying yes would be." She looked at the figures. "I miss Daniel. I'll keep missing him. That doesn't go away because things are going well. It runs alongside everything else." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I lost someone too," he said. 8 years ago. A woman I was going to marry." He said it plainly, without reaching for sentiment or packaging it carefully. "I didn't handle it well. I went into the work and I stayed in the work, and I stopped expecting much from anything outside of it." She held very still. Not careful still, the way she'd sometimes held still on the drive, when a conversation needed space to develop. Just attentive. "The covered plate," he said. "The first time I found it, I sat with it for about 10 minutes before I ate it. Couldn't figure out why it made me so angry." "Were you angry?" "At first. Not at you. At myself. Because it was such a small thing and it mattered so much. And that seemed like evidence of how much had gone wrong." He looked at the table. If a covered plate is the most someone has cared about you in years, that's not a warm feeling. It's an accounting of damage. She understood this. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had sat in a boarding house room in Abilene and felt the softness of a mattress and needed 4 minutes just to locate herself. "And then," she said. "And then I ate it," he said. "And it was the best meal I'd had in years." And I thought, all right, somebody thought to do this. That's real. That happened. He looked up. "I'm better at taking that in now than I was, slower than I'd like, but better." She looked at him for a moment. "We're both better than we were," she said. "That's not nothing." "No," he said, "it's not nothing." The depot was quiet around them, new lumber settling, a horse shifting in the paddock outside, the ordinary sounds of a place that was becoming something. She thought about the word becoming, and how it was always the most accurate description of anything worth paying attention to. Not arrived. Not finished, becoming, she closed the supply log. Same time tomorrow, she said. Same time tomorrow, he said and stood. He paused at the door, not turning around. Lillian, he said. Yes, thank you. For the plate. All of them. She looked at the closed log on the table. You were always worth the best portion, she said. You just needed someone to say it out loud. He went out. The door closed quietly behind him. She sat with the lamp for another few minutes in the silence of the new building, with the starter crate on the shelf beside the window, and the supply log on the table, and the first drive 6 weeks away, and the thing that had begun in a spring camp in Texas, in humiliation, in dust. In 30 men laughing at a verdict arrived here at last. Not triumph, exactly. Not the clean, finished victory of stories told in retrospect. Just a woman at a table, with work she understood the value of, in a place she was building rather than inheriting. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than the man who'd handed her a broken wagon had ever intended to give her. Fed the starter, banked the lamp, and went to bed.